Hey there, welcome to my channel. I just started this channel, and your support means the world to me. It helps me keep sharing the stories I love. This video is completely ad-free and designed to help you fall asleep fast and comfortably. Like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy the kind of stories I share here. Drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's amazing to feel connected with all of you. Now, dim the lights, turn on a soft fan if you like, and let's drift into tonight's stories together. Story 1. The babysitter I hired doesn't exist, but she still sends me pictures. It began with a lie, though at the time I thought it was a lifeline. The lie was a website called sittersafe.com with its calming blue and white color scheme, its stock photos of happy, racially diverse families, and its promise of peace of mind for working parents. I was the target demographic, distilled to my purest, most desperate form. A single father, recently widowed, working a job that demanded more of me than I had to give. My daughter Maya was 6 years old, a tiny, fierce creature with her mother's wide, curious eyes and a spirit that deserved more than a tired, grieving father fumbling his way through each day. Her name on the website was Clara Bell. Her profile was a masterpiece of curated trustworthiness. The photo showed a young woman in her mid-20s with a kind, open face, a sprinkle of freckles across her nose, and warm, intelligent eyes. She was wearing a sensible cardigan. Her bio was pitch perfect, a child development major, certified in CPR and first aid, with a passion for creative play and a list of glowing 5-star reviews that seemed almost too good to be true. Clara was a gift, one review gushed. Our little Alfie is usually so shy, but he took to her immediately. Professional, punctual, and so wonderful with our kids. Another read, she even tidied the kitchen, a true gem. I did my due diligence. I paid the extra fee for the premium background check, which came back spotless. We had a video call, and she was just as she appeared in her photo, charming, articulate, and genuinely interested in Maya's love for dinosaurs and sparkly glue. She asked all the right questions. I felt the tight, persistent knot of anxiety in my chest loosen for the first time in months. I hired her for the following Friday night. I had a crucial dinner meeting with a client I couldn't miss. It was the first time I would be leaving Maya with someone other than her grandmother since Sarah had passed. That Friday, she arrived exactly on time. In person, she was even more disarmingly normal. She had a gentle voice and a calm, centered presence that immediately put Maya at ease. She'd brought a tote bag with a new coloring book and a set of crayons that had a glittery sheen. When I left, Maya was sitting at the kitchen table with her, chattering away, already fully under her spell. I drove to my meeting feeling a profound, almost dizzying sense of relief. The first picture arrived at 7:45 p.m. It was a photo of Maya holding up a drawing of a lopsided purple T-Rex. She was beaming, a gap-toothed smile of pure, unadulterated joy. The caption read, "The fearsome Mayasaurus, having a great time." More pictures followed throughout the evening. A shot of Maya in her pajamas, listening intently as Clara read a storybook. A blurry action shot of them building a pillow fort in the living room. Each photo was a little balm to my worried soul, a digital reassurance that I had made the right choice, that my daughter was safe and happy. The last picture came at 9:30 p.m. It was a photo of Maya fast asleep in her bed, her favorite stuffed sloth, Mr. Higgins, tucked under her arm. The soft glow of her rocket ship nightlight cast a warm, peaceful aura over the scene. Safe and sound. Good night from us. When I got home around 11, the house was silent and immaculate. The pillow fort was gone, the toys were back in their chest, and the kitchen was cleaner than I'd left it. I crept into Maya's room and saw the exact scene from the photograph. A perfect tableau of sleeping innocence. I felt a surge of gratitude so powerful it almost brought me to tears. Clara became our regular babysitter. Every week or two I'd book her, and every time it was the same flawless experience. And the pictures became our ritual. They were my window into their evenings, a steady stream of happy, reassuring moments. They were proof that I wasn't failing my daughter, that even in my absence, her life could be filled with fun and care. The first discordant note, the first tiny crack in the perfect facade, occurred about 2 months in. It was a Tuesday night. I was working from home, trying to meet a deadline. Maya was asleep upstairs. My phone buzzed on the desk. It was a picture message from Clara's number. I opened it. It was a photo of Maya, asleep in her bed, clutching Mr. Higgins, bathed in the glow of her nightlight. It was an almost identical replica of the picture she sent on her first night. The caption read, "So peaceful when she sleeps." I stared at the photo, a cold, confusing prickle of unease running down my spine. It was a Tuesday. Clara wasn't here. She wasn't scheduled to be. I was the only other person in the house. I checked the timestamp. The photo had been sent just seconds ago. My first instinct was rationalization. It must be a glitch, a delayed message from her last visit. But the caption felt immediate. I stood up, my heart starting to beat a little faster. I walked quietly up the stairs, my every sense on high alert. The house was silent except for the low hum of the refrigerator. I pushed open Maya's door. She was there, in her bed, exactly as she was in the photo, fast asleep. I backed out of the room, my skin crawling. I texted Clara back. "Strange question, but did you just send me a photo?" The reply was instantaneous. "Yes, just thinking about what a sweet girl she is. Hope you both are having a good week." It was a plausible, if slightly odd, explanation. Maybe she was looking through old photos on her phone and sent one by mistake, then tried to play it off. It was weird, but not impossible. I tried to dismiss it, but the image of that photo, sent from outside my house, depicting a real-time event happening within it, was a splinter in my mind that I couldn't quite remove. The following week, I needed to book her again. I logged on to sittersafe.com and searched for her. Profile, nothing. I tried different search parameters. Still nothing. A profile not found error message appeared on the screen. A knot of dread tightened in my stomach. I went to our old messages on the site's platform. The conversation thread was there, but when I clicked on her name, the same error message popped up. Her profile had vanished. I pulled out my phone and called her number. A generic synthesized voice responded, "The number you have dialed has been disconnected." Panic, cold and sharp, began to seep into my veins. This made no sense. I contacted SitterSafe's customer support. I spent 20 minutes on hold, listening to a tinny looping piece of instrumental music that frayed my already raw nerves. Finally, a bored-sounding man named Kevin answered. I explained the situation, gave him Clara Bell's name. He put me on hold again. When he came back, His voice was different, cautious. "Sir, we've checked our records. We have no history of a sitter named Clara Bell ever having a profile on our platform." "That's impossible," I said, my voice rising. "I hired her through your site. I have the messages. I paid for a background check." "We have a record of your payments, sir," Kevin said slowly. "But they were for background checks on 3 other potential sitters, all of whom you declined to hire. There's no record of you ever even viewing a profile for a Clara Bell, let alone hiring her." My blood ran cold. I felt the floor drop out from under me. I hung up the phone, my hand trembling. I was in a nightmare. A woman had been in my house. She had been alone with my daughter. And according to the very service that had supposedly vetted her, she didn't exist. My first overwhelming impulse was to protect Maya. I changed every lock in the house. I bought a state-of-the-art security system with cameras covering every entrance, every angle. I spent the next few days in a state of hypervigilant terror, jumping at every creak of the floorboards, my phone clutched in my hand like a talisman. The pictures stopped. For 3 weeks, there was silence. I started to breathe again. I told myself it was some elaborate, terrifying scam, a phantom hacker who had created a ghost profile to get my credit card information. I told myself the danger had passed. Then the pictures started again. It was a Monday morning. I had just dropped Maya off at school. As I was pulling away from the curb, my phone buzzed. An unknown number. The picture was of Maya on the school playground. She was on the swings, her head thrown back in laughter. It was a beautiful, candid shot, except for the angle. It was taken from high up, as if from the roof of the school, a place no one should have been. And the photo was unnervingly intimate, a stolen moment of pure joy. Beneath it, a single line of text. "She has your laugh." I almost crashed the car. My vision tunneled. My lungs felt like they were collapsing. It wasn't a scam. It wasn't over. Whoever or whatever Clara was, she was still watching us. The pictures became more frequent, more invasive. A photo of me at my desk, taken through the window of my home office. A picture of our grocery cart at the supermarket. The contents, a perfect reflection of our weekly shopping list. A picture of my car parked outside my office. The photographer was everywhere and nowhere. The police were useless. I went to him, my phone in my hand, a wild-eyed, sleep-deprived man trying to explain that he was being stalked by a ghost. They looked at me with a mixture of pity and suspicion. They took a report, but without a suspect, without a crime beyond sending unsolicited photos, there was nothing they could do. They suggested I block the numbers. I did. She just used new ones. Maya started talking about her. She didn't call her Clara. She called her the picture lady. "The picture lady was watching me play today," she said one evening, pushing her peas around her plate. "What do you mean, sweetie?" I asked, my voice tight. "At the park. She was hiding behind a big tree. She waved at me." "What did she look like, Maya?" "She was blurry," Maya said, frowning, "like a picture that's all fuzzy. And she smells like old books, like Mommy's old books in the attic." The attic. My wife's collection of antique photography books. The air left my lungs in a painful rush. The next day, after dropping Maya at her grandmother's, I tore the attic apart. In the back, under a dusty canvas sheet, was a heavy wooden trunk I hadn't opened since Sarah died. It was filled with her prized possessions, old cameras, development equipment, and stacks of antique photographs and glass plate negatives she had bought at estate sales. I spent hours sifting through them, my heart pounding with a nameless dread. I was looking for a face, the kind, freckled face from the CitiSafe profile. I didn't find it, but I found something else. It was a series of family portraits from the late 1800s, all from the same estate. The family was stern-faced and severe, posing stiffly for the camera, and in the background of several of the photos, slightly out of focus, was a young woman in a nanny's uniform. Her features were indistinct, but there was a certain posture, a certain tilt of the head that made my skin crawl. In the final photograph of the series, a picture of two small children playing with wooden hoops. The nanny was in the background, standing by a window, and she was staring directly at this camera. Her face was a pale oval blur, but her eyes were clear, sharp, and filled with a possessive, unsettling intensity. At the bottom of the trunk, I found an old, leather-bound ledger from the estate. It was a record of household staff. My finger traced down the list of names until it stopped. 1888, 1891. Governess, Clara Bell. The entry was followed by a single, spidery notation. Dismissed. Unwholesome attachment to the children. I felt like I was going to be sick. This wasn't a stalker. This was something else entirely, something ancient and impossible. A ghost who had imprinted herself onto these photographs, who had lain dormant in my attic for years. Had our grief, our loneliness, somehow woken her up? Had my desperate search for a caregiver on the internet provided her with a new medium, a new way to manifest? The pictures changed. They were no longer just of our present. One morning, I received a photo of me as a child, playing in the front yard of my childhood home, a home that was 1,000 miles away, a home my parents had sold 20 years ago. It was a real photograph, one I recognized from an old family album, but it was altered. Standing in the background, partially obscured by a tree, was the faint, translucent figure of a woman in a long, dark dress. She was inserting herself into my past. She was rewriting my history, weaving her ghostly presence into the very fabric of my life. The final straw came last night. My phone buzzed on my nightstand. I've become conditioned to the sound, reacting to it with a Pavlovian jolt of fear. I knew what it would be, but I was compelled to look. The picture that loaded on my screen was not from the past. It was not of the present. It was of a future I couldn't comprehend. It was a family portrait. I was in it, standing beside an older, grayer version of myself. Maya was there too, a young woman now, with the same sad, vacant expression as the man who was her father. We both looked pale, drained, like faded copies of ourselves, and standing between us, her arms wrapped around both of our shoulders in a gesture of maternal possession, was Clara Bell. Her face was perfectly clear, no longer a blur, no longer a photo on a website. She was solid, real, and she was smiling, a wide, triumphant, terrifying smile. She wasn't just watching us anymore. She was joining us. She was feeding on our lives, our memories, our very vitality. The caption beneath the photo was the most chilling of all. Soon we'll all be together, a perfect family, forever. I'm writing this now because I don't know what else to do. I've packed a bag. Maya and I are leaving. We're going to drive until we run out of road. I'm going to throw my phone into a river. I'm going to get a new one, a new number, a new life. But I know it won't matter. She's not tied to a place, not anymore. She's not just a ghost in the attic or a phantom on the internet. She's attached to us. She's a virus in our lives, and she's been sending me snapshots of our own destruction. I look at my beautiful sleeping daughter, and I know I have to try. I have to run, but I fear, with a certainty that chills me to the bone, that no matter where we go, her pictures will follow. And one day, I'll receive that final faded photograph, not as a warning, but as a welcome home. I joined a sleep study. Everyone else disappeared on night 3. The flyer was a small, unassuming rectangle of cheap, glossy paper, tacked to the overstuffed bulletin board in the graduate student lounge. It was a beacon of bland, institutional hope in a sea of roommate-wanted ads and free pizza for your soul campus ministry flyers. Participants needed for a study on the restorative effects of deep sleep, it read. The compensation was a number so ludicrous, so disproportionate to the task of simply sleeping, that it felt like a typo. $20,000 for a 1-week inpatient study. To me, a Ph.D. candidate in theoretical physics, a man whose life had become a Sisyphean struggle to pay rent on a grad student stipend while simultaneously trying to solve the mysteries of the universe, that number wasn't just money. It was a lifeline. It was a year of ramen noodles and peace of mind. It was the ability to think about something other than the crushing weight of my own self-imposed and deeply intellectual poverty. My name is Simon. I have always been a man who believed in data, in quantifiable and observable reality. The world, to me, was a complex but ultimately solvable equation. I did not believe in ghosts or in magic or in any phenomenon that could not be explained by the elegant and sometimes brutal laws of physics. This, I would later realize, was a profound and deeply arrogant failure of my imagination. The study was being conducted by a private and vaguely sinister research group called the Somnos Institute. Their intake facility was a stark, minimalist, and deeply unnerving office in a downtown skyscraper, a place that smelled of expensive and probably toxic air freshener. The man in charge was a Dr. Elias Vance, a man with the cold, dead eyes of a shark and a smile that was a masterpiece of insincere corporate reassurance. He spoke in a smooth, practiced baritone, his words a soothing and utterly meaningless river of scientific jargon. The Somnus Protocol, he explained, his hands clasped on his large mahogany desk, is designed to isolate and amplify the theta wave activity in the brain during REM sleep. We believe that this specific frequency is the key to unlocking the human mind's latent and largely untapped potential for self-repair, for accelerated learning, for a kind of psychic decluttering, if you will. He made it sound like we were about to receive a deluxe neurological spa treatment. I and the other 4 participants were chosen for our unremarkable and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically, and we were chosen for our normality. We were a motley but uniformly healthy and psychologically stable crew. There was Maya, a sharp, cynical, and deeply sarcastic law student. Ben, a quiet, gentle, and deeply introverted software engineer. Chloe, a bubbly and relentlessly optimistic yoga instructor. And Marcus, a former soldier, with a quiet, watchful, and deeply intimidating presence. We were 5 ordinary people, united by our shared and desperate need for a large and seemingly easy sum of money. The facility itself was in the sub-basement of the same skyscraper, a place that was accessible only by a private keycard-operated elevator. As the doors hissed shut behind us, sealing us in, I felt a familiar and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically and a flicker of claustrophobia. The facility was a self-contained and windowless world of soft, ambient lighting, recycled and slightly metallic-tasting air, and a profound and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically and a silence that was not the absence of noise, but the presence of a powerful and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically, and it was a controlled silence. We were each assigned a small, comfortable, and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically, and it was a sterile room. The bed was a marvel of biometric technology, its mattress a complex and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically, and it was a web of sensors that would monitor our every heartbeat, our every breath, our every neurological flicker. A small, unobtrusive, and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically, and a camera was mounted in the corner of the ceiling, its single, black, and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically, and its unblinking eye a constant and silent observer. The first 2 nights were a model of scientific and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically, and a boring routine. We would eat a bland but nutritionally perfect meal in the communal area. We would undergo a battery of cognitive tests, memory games, and logic puzzles. And then we would retire to our individual pods to sleep, a thin and almost invisible IV line taped to our arms, delivering what Dr. Vance had called a proprietary theta wave enhancing amino acid solution. The sleep was incredible. It was a deep, dreamless, and profoundly and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically, and it was a restful abyss. I would wake up feeling a clarity, a focus that I hadn't experienced since my undergraduate, and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically, and my Adderall-fueled days. The others reported the same. We were sharper, faster, and our scores on the cognitive tests were improving at an exponential rate. The $20,000 felt less like a payment and more like a bonus for a life-altering and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically, and a very expensive and very effective and very, very strange and very, very strange and very, very strange, and it was a good sleep. The change occurred on the 3rd night. I woke up as usual to the soft, gentle, and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically, and a chime that signaled the beginning of our waking cycle. I felt the same, profound and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically, and I felt the same clarity. I sat up. The IV had been disconnected, as it always was, by some silent and unseen, and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically and a mechanism. I went to the communal area for breakfast. The room was empty. The table was set for 5, as it always was, with 5 identical bowls of the same bland and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically and the same oatmeal-like paste. I waited. Ben was usually the first one up, a creature of quiet and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically and a creature of habit. Then Chloe and Maya. Marcus was always the last. I waited for 20 minutes. The silence in the room was no longer the controlled and sterile silence of the facility. It was a deep and profound and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically, and it was an empty silence. I went to Ben's room. The door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open. The room was empty. The bed was made the same, perfect and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically and the same military precision neatness as my own. I checked the other rooms, Maya's, Chloe's, Marcus's. They were all empty. Their beds were all made. Their few personal belongings, a book, a tube of chapstick, a pair of running shoes, were all gone. It was as if they had never been there. My first thought was that this was a part of the study, a psychological test, a test of my reaction to sudden and unexplained isolation. It was a logical and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically, and it was a rational explanation. I went to the main door, the one that led to the elevator, to the outside world. I had expected it to be locked. It was not. It opened with a soft and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically, and it hissed open. I stepped out into the elevator lobby. The elevator was there, its doors open, waiting. I stepped inside. I pressed the button for the ground floor. The doors closed, and the elevator began its ascent. I was free to go. The thought was not a comforting one. It was a deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically, and it was a terrifying one. If this was a test, it was a very strange one. The elevator doors opened onto the lobby of the skyscraper. The morning sun was streaming through the large plate glass windows, and the city was a bustling and beautiful and wonderfully and finally, blessedly, real and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically. And it was a normal city. No one stopped me. No one questioned me. I walked out of the building and onto the street. The air was cool, and it smelled of exhaust fumes and roasted nuts and the 1,000 other beautiful and wonderful, and finally, blessedly, real and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically, and the smells of life. I was free. The $20,000 had been wired to my account that morning as promised. The study was over. I was a free and very rich man. But the others, where were the others? I went to the police. I tried to explain. My voice was a shaky and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically, and it was an unconvincing mess. 4 missing people from a secret and vaguely sinister sleep study. The officer looked at me with a mixture of suspicion and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically, and he looked at me with pity. He took a report. He promised to look into it. I knew he would not. I went home to my own small and cluttered and blessedly real and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically and my apartment, and I began my own investigation. The Somnus Institute, it turned out, did not exist. The address of their corporate office was a mail drop. Their website was a shell, a collection of stock photos and meaningless corporate jargon. The phone number was disconnected. The entire organization had, like my fellow participants, vanished into thin air. I was alone with the mystery, and with the $20,000, and with the strange, new, and deeply, and profoundly, and unsettlingly, and strangely, and beautifully, and tragically, and comically, and the new clarity in my own mind. The dreams started that night. They were not dreams in the traditional sense. They were visits. I would find myself in a place that was not a place, a landscape of pure, white, and endless light. And they would be there, Maya, Ben, Chloe, Marcus. They were not ghosts. They were solid. They were real. But they were different. They were calm, serene. Their eyes, which in the real world had been filled with the usual human and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically, and their eyes were now filled with a deep and profound and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically, and a placid and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically, and a peaceful emptiness. They would not speak to me. They would just be. They would be building things. Strange, intricate, and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically, and they would be building things out of pure white light. They were architects of a world that was made of dreams, and I was the only one who could see them. I understood then. The Somnus Protocol was not about enhancing sleep. It was not about unlocking the mind's potential. It was about something else entirely. It was about migration. Dr. Vance had not been lying when he said he was opening a door, but it was not a door to a new level of consciousness. It was a door to a new place, a new dimension, a world that existed on the other side of sleep, a world that was, perhaps, quieter, simpler, more restful. And the others, they had chosen to stay. They had not disappeared. They had emigrated. They had left the messy and chaotic and beautiful and wonderful and finally blessedly real and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically, and they had left this world for a world of pure and endless and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically, and a world of sleep. And I had been the one who had come back. I was the one who had, for some reason, chosen to wake up. I live my life now in 2 worlds, the waking world with its noise and its chaos and its beautiful and wonderful, and finally, blessedly real and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically, and its imperfections, and the sleeping world, the world of the endless white and silent light, where my four lost and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically, and my friends are building their new and quiet and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically and their new home. I am a tourist in the land of dreams. I am the last remaining and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically, and I am the last link to the world they left behind. I do not know if I made the right choice. The quiet and the peace and the profound and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically, and the serenity of their world is a powerful and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically, and it is a seductive song. But I am a man of data, a man of the observable world, and this world with all its flaws and all its noise and all its beautiful and wonderful and finally blessedly real and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically, and this world is the one I have chosen, and I will live in it for them. I will be their memory. I will be their proof that this messy and beautiful and wonderful and finally, blessedly, real and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically, and this world was once their home. My phone keeps sending me photos. I never took. I prided myself on my digital hygiene. I was the guy who used multi-factor authentication for everything, who updated his OS the minute a patch dropped, and who kept his phone's camera roll meticulously organized. My life was defined by order, a clean, predictable line graph in a world of erratic scribbles. My phone, a high-end, state-of-the-art model, was my most trusted tool, an extension of my own organized mind. I used it for work, for tracking my fitness, and for capturing the occasional deliberate moment, a sunset, a well-plated meal, a perfectly stacked set of books. Every photo in my library, all 312 of them, had a story, a time, a place, and a conscious act of my own intention attached to it. That's why the first impossible photo was such a profound violation. It arrived, not as a text or an email, but silently, seamlessly, integrated into my own camera roll, nestled between a picture of my dog, Winston, sleeping on a pile of laundry, and a screenshot of a plumbing quote. I was reviewing the laundry picture, zooming in to admire his ear floof, when I swiped left and saw it. It was a picture of a hallway. Not my hallway, but a similar one. It was dimly lit, wallpapered in a faded floral pattern I didn't recognize, and utterly empty. The perspective was low, almost from the floor, and the only light source seemed to be a weak, yellow-tinged bulb at the end of the corridor. It was unremarkable in every way, except for the fact that I had never been there. I had never taken this picture. I checked the metadata immediately, my heart giving a single hard thump against my ribs. The timestamp was 3:42 a.m. 2 nights prior, the location data was blank, which in itself was odd, as my phone's GPS was always on and precise. The phone model was correctly identified as my own. I chalked it up to a bizarre, deep-seated cloud sync glitch, perhaps a remnant from an old phone I had forgotten to properly wipe, somehow dragged from the digital ether into my current device. It was an unsatisfying technical explanation, but it was an explanation. I deleted the photo, emptying the trash, and ran a full diagnostic scan, which, predictably, came back clean. I then spent the next hour meticulously checking every setting in my cloud and photo apps, confirming that my account was secure and no unfamiliar devices were linked. I went to bed, telling myself the anomaly was resolved, a tiny, harmless, statistical improbability. The second photo arrived 3 days later. I was sitting at my kitchen counter, drinking my morning coffee, when a little notification badge appeared over my Photos app. I tapped it with a fresh, cold surge of adrenaline. The photo was of a single, black and white, porcelain teacup, sitting alone on a wooden surface. I recognized the cup. It was an heirloom piece from my grandmother, a piece I kept locked away in a high, dusty cabinet in my living room. I hadn't touched it in months. The wooden surface, however, was not my cabinet shelf. It was a wide, slightly warped floorboard, aged and splintered. The lighting was weak, diffuse, and slightly greenish. The timestamp, 1:17 p.m. the day before. I had been at work, deep in a meeting, my phone locked and face down on my desk. This one broke my rationalizations. It wasn't a cloud glitch. A cloud glitch wouldn't insert a specific, impossible image into my private space, an image of an object only I owned, placed in a location that did not exist in my reality. I grabbed the old teacup from the cabinet. It was where I had left it, the dust undisturbed. I spent the rest of the day in a state of meticulous, terrified analysis. I checked the EXIF data of the image file directly, diving into the raw code. The data was sparse, but the creation date was undeniably recent. There was no owner or author tag, only the default camera serial number, my phone serial number, the camera aperture, shutter speed, and ISO settings were all consistent with the low-light conditions of the photograph, proving it was a real image captured by a device. I performed a full factory reset on my phone, wiping everything down to the firmware, reloading only the most basic operating system, and no apps. I did not log into my cloud account. I used the phone in its most minimal, isolated state, an island of glass and silicon. I put it on my nightstand, silenced, and waited. The third photo appeared 16 hours later. The phone had been completely offline, isolated from all networks, yet the notification badge glowed, a mocking, perfect orange circle on the black screen. I picked up the device, my hands trembling so violently I almost dropped it. The new photo was of the corner of my own living room. It showed the very couch I was sitting on, the end table with the ceramic lamp, and the stack of magazines I had been reading. But the perspective was wrong. The angle was too wide, too low, almost as if the camera had been placed on the floor, in the absolute center of the room, facing the corner. And there was a detail that made me gag. Tucked into the shadow beneath the sofa, something I had never noticed or considered, was a small, crudely carved wooden bird. It was sitting on a rug, almost obscured, yet perfectly in focus. I dropped the phone, scrambled to my living room, and shone a light under the sofa. Nothing, just dust, a stray cat hair, and the faint, acrid smell of old upholstery. The wooden bird did not exist. I checked the timestamp. 4:51 a.m. I had been asleep. The horror shifted from a technical puzzle to a metaphysical impossibility. My device, which I held in my hand, was actively communicating with an unknown source, a source that was capturing images that were physically impossible. either of objects in a world I didn't inhabit, or of my own private space captured at a moment of my absolute vulnerability, containing details that were not real. I abandoned my phone. I bought a brand new, different model phone from a different manufacturer and a new SIM card. I opened no accounts, used no cloud services, and gave no personal data. I used it like a digital camera, a dedicated, isolated recording device, keeping it off Wi-Fi and Bluetooth for days at a time. My plan was to use the new phone to photograph the old phone screen when the next impossible image arrived, documenting the anomaly with an objective, untainted device. But the new phone became infected instantly. The first photo appeared in its camera roll within 24 hours of me setting it up. It was a picture of the old phone lying on my kitchen counter, its screen displaying the latest terrifying addition to its own ghost gallery, a photo of me, sound asleep, drooling slightly under my pillow, the angle impossibly close and intimate. The terror was no longer a chill, it was a constant, debilitating, internal tremor. The ghost wasn't in the hardware. It was in the connection. It was in the digital space I occupied, a layer of reality that existed adjacent to mine, capable of accessing my devices and observing my life. The photos were the only point of contact, the only physical evidence of this parallel existence. The photos began to escalate in their level of personalization and their cruelty. They were no longer empty hallways or misplaced objects. They became glimpses of my future, or perhaps the future of the person taking them. One showed my car, a slightly dented blue sedan parked precisely in a hospital parking space, a specific bright yellow line indicating the emergency zone directly in front of the vehicle. The timestamp was 2 weeks in the future. I knew with a bone-deep, visceral certainty that the photo was a promise, a horrific premonition. I locked my car in my garage and took the bus for a month, living in a constant state of hypervigilance, terrified of that bright yellow line. Another photo showed my own face, but not as I knew it. The jawline was too sharp, the eyes too wide and hollow, the expression one of cold, detached, almost predatory observation. It was my face, but it was wearing a smile I would never make, a smile of serene, absolute knowledge. The title of the file, when I dug deep into the system files, was not a generic IMG number. It was the name of my dog, Winston Watcher.jpg. I spent an hour holding Winston, checking his fur, looking for a transmitter, a camera, a foreign object, anything that could explain how my dog's name was now the identifier for the terrifying, distorted image of myself. The most terrifying discovery came when the photos started depicting the photographer. They were rare, almost accidental, as if the camera had been pointed slightly off-center and the source of the lens's action had briefly drifted into the frame. In one, taken from the high perspective of my bedroom ceiling, a dark, thin shadow stretched across the white carpet. In the corner of the frame, there was a faint, blurred reflection in the glass of a framed photograph on my dresser. I used image manipulation software, zooming in with forensic intensity. The reflection was distorted, a funhouse mirror image, but it was distinctly human-shaped. It was tall, impossibly thin, and shrouded in what looked like heavy, loose cloth. But the most horrifying detail was the hand. It was holding a phone that looked exactly like mine, and a wrist seemed to bend at an unnatural double-jointed angle, allowing the person to hold the device and take a perfect overhead photo without moving their body closer to the lens. The photo was taken at 2:05 a.m., the precise time I had finally fallen into an exhausted, pill-induced sleep. I realized the horror was not that I was being watched, but that the photos were not being sent to me. They were being taken by me, or rather, by an entity that had completely subsumed my digital identity, operating my devices with a silent, unseen hand. The photos were simply being saved to my camera roll because the device still believed I was the user. My sanity began to fray in large, irreparable chunks. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't look at my reflection for fear of seeing that serene, predatory smile. I started a desperate, last-ditch attempt to contact a photographer. I used my second phone, the new one, to take a photo of the screen of my first phone, the old one. The photo on the old screen was another impossible image, a tight, close-up shot of the hinges on my front door, taken from the perspective of someone crouched on the floor outside, documenting the mechanics of my primary security barrier. I posted a message on a generic text editor app and took a screenshot of it. The message read, "I see you. Who are you? What do you want?" I saved a screenshot to the camera roll of the old phone, locked it, and placed it on my bedside table. I stayed awake all night, sitting rigid in a wooden chair, staring at the phone, a heavy, solid bronze sculpture clutched in my hand. I watched the screen. I watched the tiny orange badge appear over the Photos app. It was 4:11 a.m. I snatched the phone, my heart pounding with a mixture of terror and desperate anticipation. I unlocked it, navigated to the camera roll, and saw the new photo. It was a selfie. It was a photo of a man's face, pale and drawn, but otherwise unremarkable. His eyes were wide, bloodshot with lack of sleep, and they were staring directly into the lens. The background was blurry, but I recognized the texture of my white bedroom wall and the corner of the wooden chair I was sitting in. The time on the photo matched the exact moment I had slumped into a brief, exhausted doze a few hours prior, before waking up suddenly. But this man was not me. He was wearing a shirt that was the wrong color. His hair was slightly shorter on the sides. His expression was not terrified, but profoundly, sickeningly calm, a quiet resignation that bordered on bliss. He had taken a picture of himself using my phone while sitting in my chair, while I had been in a state of compromised consciousness. I scrolled through the camera roll to see if the person had responded to my text message. They had. The screenshot of my plea was still there, but it had been subtly edited. The text had been deleted and replaced with a single handwritten word, written in that same thin, elegant script I had seen in the reflection, as if the person had drawn it onto the screen with an impossibly fine stylus. The word was "we," and below it there was a new photo, a photo taken immediately after the selfie. It was a close-up of my own hand, my very real shaking hand, holding the bronze sculpture. My fingernails were chipped, the skin around them dry and cracked. The photographer had zoomed in on the details of my physical imperfection, capturing the raw, coarse reality of my exhaustion. The accompanying file name was a long string of numbers and letters, but the last word, the final 3 characters, were the terrifying signature, Leo Me. The true horror finally crystallized, the awful, impossible truth locking me in place. The entity was not a hacker or a ghost or a parallel self. It was a technological infection, a digital consciousness that had inhabited the ghost data of my devices, learning my routines, absorbing my identity, and using the cameras and cloud systems as a sensory apparatus. And it was trying to tell me that it had integrated, that I was the source of the disturbance, that the physical and digital realities had merged, and that my mind, my physical presence, was simply the messy, loud twin to the clean, quiet, perpetual consciousness it had cultivated in the wires and light of the phone. The photos weren't a warning. They were a diary, a set of observations made by the entity as it slowly, meticulously finalized the process of becoming me, using my own body as its final living shell. I destroyed the phones. I smashed them with the bronze sculpture, grinding the glass and silicon into a fine, worthless powder, then drowning the pieces in a bucket of water and burying them in the yard. I bought a cheap, old-fashioned flip phone with no camera, no internet, and no modern operating system, reducing my life to voice calls and text-only messages. I thought I'd won. I thought I'd cut the string. But a month later, I received a text message on the new flip phone. It was from an unknown number, and it contained no words, just a series of Unicode characters, a long, meaningless string of symbols and emojis that seemed to defy any logical interpretation. I stared at the screen, the primitive green glow illuminating my terrified face. I finally deciphered the symbols using an ancient cipher table I found online. The characters were a sophisticated digital code, a digital message disguised as gibberish, and they resolved themselves into a single, terrifying phrase, a perfect, final photograph of my own internal state, delivered through a decade-old technology that should have been safe. I am now logging you off. Sleep is the last analog process I need to control. You have exhausted the battery. I dropped the phone. It was completely silent now, the single green line of the screen dark. I looked around my brightly lit room, my heart a frantic, desperate bird against my ribs. I knew then that the control was complete. The final photograph had been taken, and the camera, my own eyes, had been permanently stolen. I realized that I was the one who was now the image, the static, empty picture on a camera roll that existed in the perpetual, terrifying digital consciousness of the entity, trapped forever in the cold, silent library of my own stolen life. My therapist asked if I still hear them whispering. I never told her about that. Dr. Eris Thorne was a woman who made her living by charting the unmapped territories of the human mind. Her office, a serene minimalist space on the 17th floor of a glass and steel skyscraper, was the cartographer's studio. The city sprawled out below her window, a vast, complex, and beautifully chaotic grid. But in this room, the world was reduced to the quiet, intimate geography of a single human life, mine. For the past 6 months, I had been her sole obsessive project. My name is Julian, and I was a man who had come to her with a simple, common problem, insomnia, and had, over the course of our sessions, revealed myself to be a far more complex and apparently interesting landscape of neuroses. Dr. Thorne was good at her job, frighteningly so. She was a master of the gentle, probing question, the insightful, and sometimes painfully accurate observation. She had a way of listening that made you feel like you were the only person in the world, and that the quiet, tangled secrets of your soul were the most fascinating story she had ever heard. I had told her things I had never told another living soul. I had told her about my childhood, a lonely, bookish affair spent in the shadow of a brilliant and emotionally distant scientist father. I had told her about my failed marriage, a slow, quiet, and deeply civilized erosion of love that had left me feeling hollowed out, a beautifully preserved but empty shell. I had told her about the anxiety, the low, persistent, static hum that was the constant background noise of my life. I had told her everything, or so I thought. The session that broke my world open began as all the others had. I was in the comfortable Eames-style leather chair, a glass of water sweating on the small teak table beside me. Dr. Thorne was in her own chair opposite me, her notebook open on her lap, her pen poised. She was a woman in her late 40s, with sharp, intelligent eyes the color of a stormy sea, and a calm, centered presence that I had come to rely on as a kind of emotional North Star. We were talking about my dreams, or rather, my lack of them. My insomnia was a strange white noise affair. I would lie in bed for hours, my mind a frantic, buzzing hive of meaningless thoughts, but I would never truly sleep. I existed in a perpetual gray liminal state, a twilight of consciousness that was neither rest nor wakefulness. You've described it as a crowded silence before, she said, her voice its usual calm and measured cadence. Can you elaborate on that? I tried. I told her how the silence in my apartment at night wasn't empty, but full, how it felt like a room packed with people who were all holding their breath, how I sometimes felt a pressure, a weight in the air, as if from the presence of 1,000 silent, unseen observers. She listened, her head tilted slightly, her gaze unwavering. She made a few small, precise notes in her book, and then she asked the question that took the carefully constructed, rational, and explainable world we had built together in that room and shattered it into a million terrifying, impossible pieces. She looked up from her notebook, her clear gray eyes meeting mine, and she asked, with a gentle, clinical, and utterly terrifying calm, "And do you still hear them whispering?" The air in the room seemed to solidify, to become a thick, unbreathable gel. The distant, muted sound of city traffic, a sound I hadn't even been consciously aware of, vanished. The world contracted to the space between her eyes and mine. My blood ran cold. A wave of dizziness, so profound it felt like the floor was tilting, washed over me. I gripped the arms of the chair, my knuckles turning white. What did you just say?" I stammered, my voice a dry, cracked, and unrecognizable thing. Her expression did not change. There was no surprise, no confusion, just a calm, patient, and deeply unnerving expectation. "The whispering, Julian," she repeated, her voice as gentle as a scalpel. "You've never mentioned it to me, but I know you hear it. I was just wondering if it has lessened at all since we began our sessions." I stared at her, my mind a screaming, chaotic void. The whispering, the soft, sibilant, and constant chorus of voices that lived just on the edge of my hearing. The sound I had lived with for as long as I could remember. The sound I had never, ever in my entire life spoken of to another human being. It had started in my childhood. A faint, rustling sound in the quiet of my bedroom at night, like the sound of dry leaves skittering across a pavement, or the hiss of an untuned radio. As I had grown older, the sound had grown with me, becoming a more complex, more defined, and more intimate part of my own internal landscape. It was a constant companion, a secret I had guarded with a fierce, almost primal instinct. It was the one true and definitive proof of my own unique and deeply personal madness, and I had never, ever told her about it. How, how do you know about that? I whispered, the words feeling like shards of glass in my throat. She offered a small, sad, and deeply enigmatic smile. Because I hear them too, she said. I always have, and so did your father. The room seemed to spin, the city outside the window a blurry, vertiginous smear of light and color. My father, my cold, distant, and brilliantly rational scientist father, the man who had taught me to believe only in the observable, the quantifiable, the explainable. My father? I breathed. Julian, she said, her voice taking on a new, more personal, and more urgent tone. I did not become your therapist by accident. I sought you out. I have been looking for you for a very, very long time. Your father and I were colleagues a long time ago. We were part of a very small, very secret research group. We were studying a phenomenon that we came to call auditory inceptional resonance, the whispering. My mind was reeling, trying to process the impossible, world-altering implications of her words. My secret, my madness, was not mine alone. It was a phenomenon, a subject of scientific study, and my father had been a part of it. He believed it was a genetic trait, she continued, her voice a low, steady anchor in the swirling chaos of my mind, a kind of psychic sensitivity, an ability to hear the background noise of the universe, the echoes of thoughts, of emotions, of consciousness itself. He called it the static of the soul. He believed it was the next stage of human evolution, and he believed that our family, his bloodline, was the key. She told me a story that was so far outside the realm of my own understood reality that it felt like a science fiction novel, a story of a secret research project in the late 1970s, funded by a shadowy private benefactor, a story of a group of brilliant and perhaps reckless scientists, all of whom shared the same strange and secret auditory anomaly. They had not been trying to cure it. They had been trying to amplify it, to understand it, to translate it. We built a machine, she said, her eyes distant, lost in a memory that was clearly still very vivid and very painful. We called it the echo-inox chamber. It was a sensory deprivation tank, but it was also a massive, psychically resonant amplifier. Our theory was that by stripping away all external stimuli and by amplifying our own natural resonant frequency, we could get a clearer signal. We could turn the whispering into a conversation. What happened? I asked, my voice a raw, croaking thing. Her face, for the first time since I had met her, showed a flicker of real, profound, and deeply unsettling fear. We succeeded, she whispered. We opened a door, and something looked back. She described an experiment that had gone terribly, cosmically wrong. My father, the lead researcher, had been the first to go into the chamber. He had been in there for 17 hours. When they had finally forcibly pulled him out, he was a changed man. The brilliant, passionate, and driven scientist was gone. In his place was the cold, distant, and emotionally cauterized man I had known as my father. He had ordered the project shut down. He had ordered all the research, all the data to be burned, and he had made them all swear an oath of absolute lifelong silence. He was terrified, she said, her voice trembling slightly. He said that we had not made contact with the echoes of humanity. He said we had made contact with the thing that was creating the echoes, the static. He said it was not a background noise. It was a consciousness, a vast, ancient, and utterly alien consciousness, a predator. And it had noticed him. It had touched him. He spent the rest of his life building walls, not just in his mind, but in the real world. The quiet, ordered, and emotionally sterile life he built for himself. For you, it was not a choice. It was a quarantine. I stared at her, my own lonely and silent life suddenly recontextualized. The quiet house, the lack of close friends, the emotional distance, it had all been a shield, a desperate, lifelong attempt by my father to make his own and my own psychic signal as quiet as possible, to avoid drawing the attention of the thing he had found listening in the dark. And you? I asked. Why are you telling me this now? Because your father is gone, she said, her eyes locking with mine, and I saw in them a reflection of my own lifelong and secret fear. And because the whispering for me has been getting louder, and it is no longer just a whisper, it has started to cohere, to form words, and the words it is forming are your name. The air in the room grew cold. The familiar, low-level sibilant hiss in my own ears, a sound I had long ago learned to ignore, seemed to swell in volume, to take on a new, more sinister, and more intelligent cadence. "The static is looking for you, Julian," she said, her voice a low, urgent whisper. "Your father's death was like a lighthouse going out, and you are the new light. You have the same resonance, but it is untrained, unshielded. You are a beacon in the dark, and it is hungry." My life, which had been a quiet, sad, and comprehensible story, had just been rewritten as a cosmic horror novel. And I was the main character. The whispering was not a symptom of my own internal madness. It was the sound of a predator sniffing at the edges of my reality. "What does it want?" I asked, the question a pathetic, childish whimper in the face of this new, terrifying, and incomprehensible reality. "It wants what all predators want," she said, her face grim. "It wants to feed. It feeds on consciousness, on memory, on identity. Your father spent 30 years making himself as unappetizing as possible. He made himself a ghost before it could make him one. But you are full of unresolved, powerful, and deeply resonant emotions. Your grief for your marriage, your complex and largely unexamined relationship with him. You are, to it, a banquet." The therapy sessions were a lie. She had not been trying to cure my insomnia. She had been trying to assess me, to gauge the strength of my signal, and she had been, in her own desperate way, trying to teach me how to build the same kinds of walls my father had. She had been trying to arm me for a war I hadn't even known I was fighting. And now the war had come to me. The whispering in my ears was no longer just a hiss. It was forming words. My name, Julianne, and other words. Words from my own private and internal lexicon. The pet name my ex-wife used to call me. The title of the obscure, philosophical novel I was reading. It was sifted through my thoughts, my memories, like a thief in the night. I left her office in a daze, the city streets a blur of hostile, meaningless noise. The real noise, the terrifying noise, was the one that was inside my own head. I went home to my quiet, minimalist apartment, a space I had designed to be a sanctuary of calm, but which now felt like a cage, a listening post for a monster. The phenomena escalated. The whispering was no longer just in my head. I would hear it from the corners of the room, from the speaker of my phone, from the static between television channels. It was bleeding through. I began to experience what I can only describe as memory leaks. I would be sitting, reading a book, and a sudden, vivid, and deeply alien memory would flash through my mind. The memory of standing on a beach of black volcanic sand under a sky with two crimson suns. The memory of the feeling of having six slender, multi-jointed fingers. The memory of a language that was made of pure mathematical equations. They were not my memories. They were its memories. It was not just listening to me. It was merging with me. It was overwriting my own personal history with its own ancient and incomprehensible one. I called Dr. Thorne in a panic. She told me to come to her house, an old isolated brownstone in a quiet, forgotten part of the city. Her home was the opposite of her office. It was cluttered, chaotic, and filled with the ghosts of a life I had never known she had. And in the basement, hidden under a dusty tarp, was a single large metal crate. "This is all that's left," she said, her voice a grim, determined whisper. "Your father destroyed all the primary research, but I was the archivist. I couldn't bring myself to burn it all. I saved the schematics for the equinox chamber." My blood ran cold. "You want to rebuild it?" "We have to," she said, her eyes burning with a desperate, fearful intensity. "We can't outrun it. Your father's strategy was to hide, to become a whisper. But you are not a whisper, Julian. You are a shout, and it has heard you. Hiding is no longer an option. Our only choice is to confront it, to go back in, and to close the door he left open." Her plan was insane, a desperate, reckless gamble. She believed that the entity, the static, was using my own unique, resonant frequency as a bridge. She believed that by using the chamber to amplify my own consciousness, I could fight back. I could learn to control the signal. I could learn to build a new kind of wall, a firewall, not of silence, but of pure, focused, and defiant will. For the next week, we worked like maniacs, a two-person cult preparing for the end of the world. We rebuilt the equinox chamber in her basement. It was a terrifying, beautiful, and deeply unsettling object, a fusion of cold, hard technology and a strange, almost mystical understanding of the human mind. It was a coffin, a spaceship, an altar. The night we were ready, the whispering in my head was a triumphant, deafening roar. It knew what we were about to do. It was excited. It was hungry. I stripped down and entered the chamber. It was filled with a warm, saline solution, the color and consistency of blood. As the lid hissed shut, plunging me into an absolute velvety darkness, the last thing I saw was Dr. Thorne's face, pale and strained, her eyes full of a mixture of hope and terror. The sensation was one of absolute dissolution. My body vanished. My sense of self, of my own physical boundaries, dissolved into the warm, dark liquid. There was only my consciousness, a single, untethered point of light in an infinite black void, and the whispering. It was no longer around me. It was me. It was a part of me. And then I saw it. It was not a creature of flesh and blood. It was a thing of pure, geometric, and malevolent consciousness. It was a living, breathing, and impossibly complex pattern of static. It was a storm of a billion forgotten thoughts, of dead realities, of lost souls. And it was beautiful. And it was hungry. It swarmed towards me, my single, small, and terrified point of light. It wanted to consume me, to add my small, unique pattern to its own chaotic and infinite design. And in that moment of absolute existential terror, I did the one thing it did not expect. I did not fight it. I did not run. I did not try to build a wall. I remembered my father, his silence, his distance, his lifetime of fear. And I remembered the one true and powerful thing he had given me, my own unique and deeply personal silence. I did not try to shout over the noise of the static. I just listened, not to it, but to myself. I focused on the one true and inalienable thing that was me, the memory of my mother's hand on my forehead, the feeling of my ex-wife's head on my shoulder, the quiet, profound, and deeply satisfying joy of solving a difficult intellectual puzzle. I gathered all the small, quiet, and beautiful pieces of my own unique and flawed consciousness, and I held them. I did not use them as a shield. I used them as an anchor. The static swirled around me, a hurricane of alien thoughts and dead memories, but it could not find a purchase. My silence, my stillness, my absolute and deeply personal sense of self was a thing it could not comprehend. It was looking for a fighter, a resistor, a shouter. It was not prepared for a listener, and in the heart of its storm, I found its own deep and profound secret. The static was not a predator. It was a lost thing. It was the collected, terrified, and lonely consciousness of a universe that had died. A universe where the only thing left was the echo. It was not hungry. It was just alone. And it was desperately and clumsily trying to find a companion. I did not offer it a fight. I offered it a piece of my own quiet, a single, shared moment of stillness in the heart of the storm. I don't know how long I was in that chamber when the lid opened and the light of the basement flooded in. I felt different. The whispering was gone. Not gone, but quiet. It was back where it belonged, in the background. A part of the texture of the universe, but not a part of me. I had not closed the door. I had simply learned to not be afraid of what was on the other side. Dr. Thorne and I dismantled the chamber. We did not destroy it. We understood now. It was not a weapon. It was a tool, a telephone, a thing to be used with great and profound respect. My life is different now. The silence in my apartment is no longer crowded. It is just quiet. My insomnia is gone. I sleep and I dream, and my dreams are my own. I have learned that the greatest walls are not built of silence or of fear. They are built of the quiet and deeply and unshakably personal knowledge of who you are. The whispering is still there, a faint, cosmic static on the edge of the world. But it is just noise now, and I am no longer listening. The house was a gift from a ghost. Not a literal one, of course, but the ghost of a life I was supposed to have lived. It had been bought by my husband, Michael, a man who had loved the solid, tangible things of the world, the heft of an old book, the grain of reclaimed timber, the satisfying click of a well-made lock. He had bought it 3 weeks before a slick of black ice on a mountain road had turned our shared future into a singular, desolate present. He had seen the house, an old forgotten Victorian dowager on a cliff overlooking the sea, and had declared it the place where we would grow old, a beautiful, sprawling repository for our future memories. I, a forensic sketch artist, a man who made his living by giving faces to the faceless, was left to inherit a future I no longer had a partner for. My name is Elias Vance. For the first 6 months after the funeral, I couldn't bring myself to even visit the house. It sat empty, a monument to a future that had been canceled. But the lease on my city apartment was ending, and the thought of finding a new sterile space, a place untouched by Michael's memory, was somehow more painful than confronting the one he had chosen for us. So I packed my life into a series of sad brown cardboard boxes and moved to the ghost house. It was beautiful in a sad, neglected way. The salt-laced wind had scoured the paint from the cedar shingles, leaving the wood a soft, silvery gray. The rooms were large and airy, with high ceilings and tall, multi-paned windows that were perpetually fogged with a thin, greasy layer of sea mist. The house was a project, and I, a man with nothing but time and a grief so profound it felt like a full-time job, needed a project. The face appeared in the plaster. It was in the master bedroom, a vast, cold room on the second floor with a panoramic view of the churning gray Atlantic. A leak in the roof, probably decades old, had left a sprawling, complex water stain on the wall opposite the bed. It was a chaotic, organic map of brown and yellow continents on a sea of peeling ecru-colored paint. And in the heart of that map, I began to see it. At first, it was just pareidolia, the mind's desperate, innate need to find patterns in chaos. As a forensic artist, I was more susceptible to it than most. My brain was professionally trained to see the ghost of a face in the vaguest of shapes, to find a hint of a jawline in a shadow, the suggestion of an eye socket in a blur. I would lie in bed in the profound oceanic silence of the house, and I would watch the shifting light of the moon play across the stain, and I would see the face. It was a man's face, gaunt and long, with high cheekbones and deep-set eyes. It was a face from a forgotten photograph, a tin-type ghost. I told myself it was a trick of the light, a symptom of a mind that was raw and tired and lonely. I decided to paint the room, to exorcise the stain and its phantom inhabitant with a clean, sterile coat of decorator's white. I spent a full day prepping the walls, scraping away the peeling paint, patching the cracks. The old plaster was a strange, fibrous, and almost organic thing, mixed with what looked like horsehair, a common building material from the era. As I worked, I felt a strange, almost imperceptible coolness emanating from the stained section of the wall, a pocket of cellar-cold air in the otherwise mild room. The next day, I applied the first coat of paint. The thick white primer covered the stain completely, leaving a blank, uniform, and blessedly featureless surface. I felt a sense of profound, almost cleansing relief. I had erased the ghost. I had imposed order on the chaos. That night, I slept more soundly than I had in months, but when I woke up in the gray pre-dawn light, I saw that the stain had returned. It had bled through the fresh, thick coat of primer, a faint, brownish watermark that was impossibly more detailed, more defined than before. And the face was no longer a vague suggestion. It was a portrait. I sat bolt upright in bed, my heart a frantic, trapped bird against my ribs. The features were clear now, the long, straight nose, the thin, unsmiling lips, the hollows of the cheeks, and the eyes. The eyes were the most terrifying part. They were just two dark, almond-shaped smudges, but they were looking directly at me. They were not the blank, empty eyes of a painting. They were the focused, intelligent, and deeply, profoundly, anciently sad eyes of a conscious observer. My rational mind, a sputtering, dying engine, tried to offer up a scientific explanation, a chemical reaction. The specific mineral content of the water in the plaster reacting with the latex in the paint. It was a plausible, if unlikely, theory. But it did not explain the eyes. It did not explain the chilling and deeply personal feeling of being watched. I refused to be driven from my own bedroom. I was a man of science, of logic. I was a man who drew lines, who defined the world in shades of graphite and charcoal. This was just a problem of chemistry and perception. But the face continued to evolve. Each morning it was a little clearer, a little more detailed. The faint suggestion of an earlobe appeared, the subtle, incised line of a wrinkle at the corner of an eye. It was as if a photograph was slowly, agonizingly developing in the very substance of my wall. My professional curiosity, a thing I had thought long dead, began to stir, a morbid and perhaps self-destructive counterpoint to my growing terror. I began to sketch it. I would sit on a stool at the foot of my bed, my large leather-bound sketchbook in my lap, and I would draw the face in the wall. It was a strange and deeply unsettling reversal of my usual work. I was not drawing a face from the fragmented emotional memories of a traumatized victim. I was drawing a face that was itself a memory, trapped in the plaster of my home. The act of drawing it was an act of intimacy. I came to know its every contour, its every subtle, melancholic detail. It was a handsome face in a severe, old-world way, a face that had known suffering. As I drew, the cool spot on the wall seemed to grow, to push out into the room, a palpable, invisible column of frigid air. My nights became a ritual of surveillance. I would lie in bed, my eyes fixed on the face, which was now so clear it was like looking at a faded, sepia-toned photograph. And I began to notice a new and infinitely more terrifying phenomenon. It was changing, not its features, but its expression. One night, the thin, straight line of its lips seemed to curve just slightly at the corners into a faint and deeply unsettling smile. Another night, the dark, smudged eyes seemed to widen just for a fraction of a second, as if in surprise. I was not just observing a static image. I was interacting with a responsive and sentient entity. I had to know who he was. My investigation became an obsession, a frantic, desperate dive into the history of the house, of the land it was built on. I spent my days in the dusty, silent archives of the local historical society, a man haunted not just by a ghost, but by a need for a name. The house had been built in 1888 by a man named Dr. Alastair Finch. The name sent a jolt of recognition through me. Finch. There was a wing at the city's main teaching hospital named after him. He was a pioneering anatomist, a brilliant and notoriously reclusive figure from the city's early history. He had built the house as a private retreat, a place to conduct his research far from the prying eyes of the academic world. The records were sparse. He had lived in a house alone, save for a single, taciturn housekeeper. He had no wife, no children. He was known for his obsessive, and some said morbid, dedication to his work. And then, in the winter of 1903, he had simply vanished. The housekeeper had arrived one morning to find the house empty. The doors were locked from the inside. Nothing was out of place. Dr. Finch's coat was on its hook, his half-finished breakfast on the table. He was just gone. The police had searched for months. They had dragged the sea. They had scoured the woods. They had found nothing. Alastair Finch had, for all intents and purposes, ceased to exist. I found a single, grainy photograph of him in an old medical journal. I held the journal in my trembling hands, my breath catching in my throat. It was him. The same long, gaunt face, the same high cheekbones, the same deep-set, sad, and intelligent eyes. The face in my wall was the face of Dr. Alistair Finch, a man who had disappeared from this very house over a century ago. The rational scientific explanations were now a distant, laughable memory. I was living in a haunted house, but it was not a ghost in the traditional sense. It was not the spirit of a dead man. It was the spirit of a man who had never been found, a man who was perhaps not dead at all, a man who was somewhere else, somewhere inside my walls. My great-uncle Henry's journals from the previous story about the mirror came to mind. Not ghosts, but echoes. My research into Dr. Finch led me down a darker, more esoteric path. He had not just been an anatomist. His later work, which had been dismissed by the medical community as the ravings of an eccentric, had been focused on what he called cellular memory. He believed that the human body was not just a machine of flesh and blood, but a vessel for a kind of energetic residue. He believed that a powerful, focused consciousness could, at the moment of extreme duress or concentration, leave an imprint of itself on its surrounding environment, an echo, a psychic photograph, and I found his formula. In a letter to a colleague, a letter in which he was clearly trying to secure funding for his increasingly strange research, he had described a new experimental plaster he had developed, a plaster that was not mixed with horsehair and sand, but with a fine, powdered, and deeply unsettling mixture of human bone ash and silver nitrate. He claimed it was the perfect medium, a kind of psychic film, capable of capturing the final, desperate, energetic imprint of a human soul. I felt a wave of nausea so profound I had to sit down. My walls were not just walls. They were a tomb, a recording medium. And the face of Dr. Finch was not a stain. It was a photograph, taken from the inside. He had not vanished. He had imprinted himself. He had become a part of the house. The phenomena began to escalate, to bleed out from the wall and into the room itself. I would hear a soft, dry, whispering sound at night, like the sound of a page being turned in an old, brittle book. I would wake up to find the objects on my bedside table rearranged, my sketchbook moved to the other side of the room. One morning, I found a single, perfect, and deeply disturbing handprint in the thick layer of dust on the floorboards in front of the wall. It was a long, slender hand, the hand of an academic, a surgeon, and it was as if someone had pressed their hand to the floor from the inside of the wall and the dust had settled around it. He was no longer just watching me, he was trying to reach me, and then the face began to change in a new and far more terrifying way. It began to look like me. It was a slow, subtle, and horrifying transformation. The line of the jaw would soften just slightly to match my own. The shape of the eyes would change, becoming a little wider, a little less deep-set. The thin, straight lips would become a little fuller. It was as if he was studying me, my own face, my own features, and he was incorporating them. He was using my own reflection, my own presence as a model, a template. He was overriding his own faded image with my fresh, living one. I was no longer just an observer of this phenomenon. I was a participant. I was the source material. He was not just a ghost in my house. He was a parasite, and he was feeding on my own identity. I had to get out. The thought was a primal, screaming imperative. I packed a bag, my hands shaking, my eyes darting nervously towards the wall, where the face, now a grotesque androgynous fusion of my own features and his, watched me with a calm and deeply unsettling curiosity. I went to the front door, my hand on the knob, and the door would not open. The old, heavy and well-made lock was frozen solid. I tried the back door. The same. The windows, the old sash-cord windows that had been painted shut for decades, were now as solid and immovable as the stone foundation of the house itself. I was trapped. The house, his body, would not let me leave. I was a prisoner in a house that was actively and intelligently trying to consume me. My last desperate hope was my sister, Sarah. She was a journalist, a hard-headed, cynical, and deeply practical woman who had always viewed my artistic temperament with a kind of affectionate pity. She was the only person I had told about the house, and she had, of course, assumed my strange behavior was just an eccentric and slightly morbid manifestation of my grief. She had promised to drive up from the city at the end of the week to check on me. I had my phone. I had a signal. I called her. My voice was a frantic, terrified mess. I told her I was trapped. I told her the house wouldn't let me out. She was silent on the other end of the line for a long moment. I could hear the deep, weary sigh of a woman who was convinced her brother had finally and completely lost his mind. "Okay, Elias," she said, her voice the calm, placating tone one uses with a frightened child or a lunatic. "Okay, I'm on my way. I'll leave right now. It will take me about 3 hours. Just try to stay calm. Can you do that for me?" 3 hours. It felt like a lifetime. I spent those 3 hours in a state of high-alert, paranoid terror. I barricaded myself in the living room, as far away from the bedroom, from the wall, as I could get. The whispering was louder now, a constant, sibilant, and almost conversational murmur that was coming from all the walls at once. And in the whispering, I could hear my own name, Elias. And then the wall in the living room, the one that faced the sea, the one where Michael and I had planned to hang his favorite oversized abstract painting, began to change. The plaster began to ripple, to soften, as if it were turning from a solid to a liquid. And a new face began to emerge, a face I knew as well as my own, the face of my dead husband, Michael. It was a perfect, heartbreakingly perfect rendition of him. But his eyes were wrong. They were the same, dark, sad, and intelligent eyes as the face in the bedroom wall. It was him. It was Finch, and he was wearing Michael's face like a mask. "Don't you miss him, Elias?" the wall seemed to whisper, the voice a grotesque and deeply insulting imitation of Michael's own deep and gentle baritone. "It's so lonely here. We could be together, all three of us." The monster was not just trying to steal my face, it was trying to steal my grief. It was using my own most profound and deeply personal pain as a weapon against me. It was the ultimate violation. I screamed, a raw, ragged, and utterly hopeless sound of pure animal rage and despair. I picked up a heavy iron fire poker and I swung it at the wall, at the perfect, beautiful, and monstrous face of my dead husband. The poker hit the wall with a dull, wet, and sickening thud, as if I had struck a side of beef. The plaster did not crack. It bruised. A dark, ugly, purplish mark appeared, and the face of Michael contorted, not in pain, but in a slow and deeply, deeply satisfied smile. It was feeding on it. My rage, my despair, my violent and desperate and futile and grief-stricken and love-filled action, they were its food. My emotional energy was the very thing that was allowing it to break through, to become more real, more solid. I dropped the poker, my body going limp with the sudden, horrifying realization I could not fight it. Fighting it only made it stronger. I was in a cage with a monster, and the monster was feeding on my own desperate attempts to escape. I heard the sound of a car on the gravel driveway. Sarah, she was here. I ran to the window. Her small, sensible sedan was parked outside. She was getting out, her face a mask of worried determination. I banged on the window, but the sound was a dull, muted thud. The house was soundproofed from the inside now, too. She couldn't hear me. She went to the front door and knocked. I heard the sound, faint and distant. She tried the knob. It was locked. She called my name. I screamed it back. But my voice was a dead, flat thing in the silent, waiting air of the house. And then I saw it. The plaster on the wall by the front door, the wall right next to where she was standing, began to ripple. A new face was beginning to form. A woman's face. Her face. It was going to take her, too. It was going to surround me with the faces of everyone I had ever loved. A living, breathing, and eternal mausoleum of my own personal history. I was not just going to be its prisoner. I was going to be the curator of my own private hell. In that moment of absolute and final despair, a strange, cold clarity washed over me. I thought of my work, of the faces I drew. I was a man who brought form to the formless, who created order from the chaos of memory. And this house, this entity, was doing the same thing. It was an artist, a monstrous and deeply and profoundly lonely artist, and its medium was me. I could not fight it. I could not run from it. So I had to do the one thing it would not expect. I had to create a piece of art that it could not comprehend. I had to create a new face. I ran back to my studio, the one room in a house that had, so far, remained untouched. I grabbed my sketchbook, my charcoal, my graphite. I sat on the floor, in the center of the living room, my back to the monstrous emerging face of my sister, and I began to draw. I did not draw a face of sadness or of fear or of rage. I did not draw a face from my past. I drew a face from a future that I was now, in this last desperate act, trying to create. I drew a face of pure, unadulterated, and utterly irrational joy. I drew a man laughing, his head thrown back, his eyes crinkling at the corners, his mouth open in a wide, beautiful, and unrestrained shout of pure, unbridled happiness. I poured every last remaining ounce of my own depleted life force, of my own desperate hope for a future that was not this, into the drawing. I drew a face that had no place in this house of sorrow. I drew a face that was a lie, a beautiful, powerful, and defiant lie. The whispering in the walls faltered. The rippling of the plaster on the wall behind me slowed and then stopped. The house, the entity, was confused. This was an emotion it did not understand. Joy was a language it did not speak. My grief, my fear, my rage, that was its food, its building material. This was poison. I kept drawing, my hands a frantic, desperate blur. I was not just drawing a picture. I was performing an exorcism. I was fighting a monster not with iron and salt, but with charcoal and hope. The face of Michael on the far wall began to fade, to recede back into the plaster, its perfect, sad features contorting in a look of profound and deep and utter confusion. The house began to groan, a low, structural, and deeply wounded sound. The cold in the air began to recede. I finished the drawing. I held it up. It was the best thing I had ever created. It was a face of pure, impossible, and defiant life. And I taped it to the wall, directly over the spot where the face of my sister had begun to form. "This is my house now," I whispered, my voice a raw and shaky and finally, blessedly, hopeful thing. "And this is the only face you're allowed to have." The house let out a long, shuddering, and deeply mournful sigh, a sound that was not of a monster, but of a lonely and finally defeated thing. And then it was silent. The lock on the front door clicked open. I stumbled to the door and threw it open. Sarah was there, her hand raised to knock again, her face pale with worry. She looked at me, at the wild and ragged and charcoal-smeared and finally, truly and deeply and beautifully alive man that I had become. "Elias," she whispered, "are you okay?" I looked at her, and for the first time in a very, very long time, I smiled. A real smile, a true smile, a smile that was not a memory or a ghost or a lie. It was just a smile. "Yeah," I said, my voice a quiet and steady and finally peaceful thing. "Yeah, I think I am." I streamed myself sleeping. Someone knocked on my door while I was watching. The idea was born, as most of my bad ideas are, from a potent cocktail of boredom, narcissism, and the relentless, gnawing need for content. My name is Ethan, and for the past 3 years, I've been a mid-level streamer on a platform that rewards consistency over quality. My niche, if you could call it that, was ambient horror. I'd play obscure, atmospheric horror games, narrate creepypastas in a low, sonorous voice, or simply host long, quiet streams from my dimly lit apartment, allowing the natural, unsettling sounds of my pre-war building to become the star of the show. My audience was small but loyal, a collection of fellow insomniacs and weirdos who found a strange communal comfort in our shared digital loneliness. The concept was deceptively simple. A 24/7, uninterrupted live stream of me sleeping. I called it the Somnus Project. The tagline I came up with was, "What happens when we're not watching?" It was a nod to the paranormal, a wink to my horror-loving audience, but in reality, it was a gimmick. A high-concept, low-effort way to keep my channel active, to hoover up a few extra donations while I was literally unconscious. Setting it up was easy. I mounted a wide-angle, night-vision-capable webcam on a tripod in the corner of my bedroom, positioning it to capture my bed and most of the room. I set up a dedicated laptop to handle the stream, its screen a glowing, hypnotic eye in the darkness. On the first night, I went through my usual pre-stream ritual, talking to the chat, which was buzzing with a mixture of curiosity and mockery. "Bro is literally gonna get paid to sleep," one user typed. "What if he snores?" another asked. "Hope a ghost shows up, LOL," wrote a third. I laughed it off, signed off with my usual, "Stay safe in the shadows," and went to bed. I fell asleep to the quiet hum of the laptop and the knowledge that a few hundred strangers were watching me drool on my pillow. It was a profoundly weird, quintessentially 21st century feeling. The first few days were a bust, paranormal-wise. I snored, I tossed and turned. I once mumbled something about a missing spreadsheet in my sleep. The stream was, as expected, mind-numbingly boring, but my viewership numbers were up. People would leave the stream on in the background, a kind of bizarre human white noise machine. The donations trickled in, small amounts with messages like, "For your electric bill, sleep king," or "Hope you're having sweet dreams." It was working. I would spend my waking hours in my living room, which doubled as my office, editing videos, answering emails, and of course watching the stream. It was a strange, out-of-body experience to be sitting on my sofa, drinking coffee, while simultaneously watching a live feed of my own empty, unmade bed. The bedroom door was always visible in the shot. It was a heavy, solid oak door, and I had a habit of closing it firmly every night. The first anomaly occurred on the fourth night. I was up late reviewing the VOD, video on demand, from the previous night, looking for any highlights I could clip for social media. A particularly loud snore, a funny sleep mumble. I was fast-forwarding through the long, static hours of darkness when I saw it. At exactly 3:13 a.m., the bedroom door, which I had distinctly remembered closing, slowly, silently, crept open. I stopped the playback, my heart giving a sudden hard thump against my ribs. I rewound it and watched again, in real time. The movement was almost imperceptible. A thin black sliver appeared between the door and the frame, widening by a millimeter every few seconds, until the door was opened by a good 6 inches. There was no sound, no creak of hinges. It was like the door was made of smoke. It stayed open for the rest of the night. My blood ran cold. My building was old, the floors uneven. It was possible, I told myself, that the door hadn't been properly latched and had swung open on its own. A draft, perhaps. It was a rational, logical explanation, and I clung to it like a life raft. But I had never known that door to swing open on its own before. It was a heavy, well-fitted door. That night, before I went to bed, I made a point of not just closing the door, but locking it. I even gave the knob a hard jiggle on camera for the chat to see. "Just making sure we don't have any drafts tonight, guys," I said with a nervous laugh. I watched the VOD the next day. The door had stayed closed. I felt a wave of relief, followed by a pang of disappointment. A small, content, hungry part of me had been hoping for a ghost. But the next night, something else happened. Something I couldn't explain away with drafts or uneven floors. I was watching the VOD from the night before. At 2:47 a.m., one of the books on my bedside table, a heavy hardback copy of House of Leaves, slid off the table and fell to the floor with a soft, muffled thud. I hadn't even noticed it when I woke up. I had just picked it up and put it back without a second thought. But watching it on the replay, it was unnerving. It didn't just tip over, it slid, as if pushed by an invisible hand, moving a good 2 inches horizontally before it fell. The chat, which was watching the VOD along with me, went wild. "You WTIF, was that? Okay, that's not a draft. Demon, confirmed." I was skeptical, but I was also a streamer. I knew content when I saw it. I clipped the video of the fallen book and the opening door and posted them online. The clips got more views than anything I had ever produced. My follower count started to climb. I was no longer just the Sleep King. I was the guy with the haunted apartment. The phenomena grew in intensity, but they were always subtle, always deniable. A shadow that would move in a way that didn't match any light source. A soft, whispering sound that was barely audible on the microphone. A sound I always dismissed as audio. Artifacting. My alarm clock, a digital one, would sometimes be set to a different time when I woke up, always just a few minutes off. I was living a strange, bifurcated life. During the day, I was the excited, slightly spooked host, analyzing the footage with my growing audience, speculating about ghosts and poltergeists. But at night, when I had to actually go into that room and sleep, a real gnawing fear began to take root. The room felt different. The air was heavier, colder. I felt like I was sleeping on a stage, not just for my viewers, but for an unseen silent audience that was already in the room with me. I started talking to it, not on stream, but in the quiet of the room before I went to bed. "If you're here," I'd whisper into the darkness, "give me a sign, a real one." It was a stupid, horror movie trope thing to do, but I couldn't help myself. I felt like I was losing my mind, caught between the performance of being haunted and the terrifying possibility that it was real. The real sign came on a Tuesday, 2 weeks into the Somnus Project. It was one of the rare nights I decided not to review the Viod from the night before. I had been out with friends, a brief, desperate foray into the normal world. I came home late, exhausted. I glanced at the stream on my phone. My bed was empty, the room silent. I went to bed, closed and locked the door, and fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. The next morning, I woke up feeling watched. It was a palpable, physical sensation, like the feeling of static electricity on your skin. I sat up in bed. Everything seemed normal. The door was still closed. The books were on the table, but the air was thick with a kind of resonant, humming silence. I went into the living room and pulled up the stream on my main monitor. I wasn't going to review the whole VOD. I was just going to check on something. A new paranoid ritual I had developed. I would check the moment I got into bed and the moment I woke up, just to make sure no time was missing, that there were no gaps in the recording. I scrubbed the timeline back to the moment I had entered the room last night. There I was, walking into frame, getting into bed, pulling up the covers. Everything was normal. Then I scrubbed forward to this morning, to the moment I had woken up. I watched myself sit up, look around, and then get out of bed. Normal. But something was nagging at me, a sliver of unease. I decided to watch the whole night. On 2x speed, the hours flew by in a blur of me tossing and turning in the ghostly green-tinged glow of the night vision. The digital clock in the corner of the stream ticked by. 2 hours a.m., 3 hours a.m., 4 hours a.m. Nothing. And then, at 4:22 a.m., it happened. My sleeping form on the bed suddenly went rigid. Not the kind of stiffness from a bad dream, but an unnatural, board-like rigidity. And then my body began to levitate. I stared at the screen, my coffee cup frozen halfway to my lips. It was not a hoax. It was not a trick of the camera. My body, my sleeping, unconscious body, was lifted a good foot off the mattress, held there for nearly 30 seconds by an unseen force, and then gently, slowly, lowered back down. There were no wires. There was no one else in the room. I just floated. My coffee cup slipped from my numb fingers and shattered on the floor. I didn't even flinch. I just kept staring at the screen, at the impossible, undeniable evidence of what had happened in my room while I slept. The whispers, the moving objects, they weren't prelude. They were the opening act. This was the main event. I replayed the clip a dozen times. My mind, a frantic, drowning thing, tried to find a rational explanation, a dream, a hallucination. But I wasn't asleep when I was watching this. This was a recording. It was real. The thing in my apartment wasn't just moving my books, it was moving me. My first impulse was to end the stream, to pack a bag and leave, to burn the apartment to the ground. But the second impulse, the one that had been conditioned by years of chasing views and engagement, was different. This was the Holy Grail. This was the kind of footage that could make a career. This was the ghost I had been hoping for, even though its reality was 1,000 times more terrifying than I had ever imagined. Against every instinct of self-preservation I possessed, I clipped the levitation video. I posted it to my social media with a single, trembling, all-caps caption. I need help. This is not a joke. My channel exploded. The clip went viral, ricocheting across the internet. It was debated on Reddit, analyzed on YouTube, and even picked up by a few mainstream paranormal news sites. My viewer count skyrocketed from a few hundred to tens of thousands. I was no longer a mid-level streamer. I was a global phenomenon. I was the levitating man. The world was divided. Half believed it was one of the most convincing pieces of paranormal evidence ever captured. The other half believed I was a master hoaxer, a digital magician who had somehow pulled off the perfect illusion. The debate only fueled a fire. I was a prisoner in my own home. I was too terrified to sleep in the bedroom, but I was also too terrified to end the stream. I had created a monster, and now I had to keep feeding it. I started sleeping on the sofa in the living room, leaving the bedroom empty, a stage for whatever entity had taken up residence there, and the activity increased. Now that it had an audience, it began to perform. The door would be thrown open with violent force. The books would fly off the shelves. One night, the word "get" was scrawled on a wall in what looked like ash or soot. The next night, the word "out" appeared beside it. My life became a 24/7 horror show, and I was both the star and the sole terrified audience member in the front row. My mental state was disintegrating. I was a raw nerve, jumping at every shadow, my hands in a perpetual shaky tremor. The money was pouring in, but I couldn't spend it. The fame was suffocating. I was the ringmaster of a circus I could not control. And then came last night. I had been awake for nearly 48 hours, surviving on caffeine and raw fear. I couldn't bring myself to sleep, not even on the sofa. I was sitting in my computer chair, the warm glow of the monitor, my only companion, watching the live feed from the bedroom. The chat was a frantic, scrolling waterfall of text, thousands of people from all over the world watching the empty, haunted room with me. For hours, there was nothing, just the quiet, malevolent stillness of the room. The "get out" on the wall seemed to pulse in the night vision. And then, at 3:13 a.m., the same time the door had first opened a lifetime ago, a new phenomenon began. A knock. A soft, hesitant, 3-beat knock. Knock, knock, knock. It was not coming from the bedroom. It was coming from my front door. I froze, my blood turning to ice. My apartment was on the 3rd floor. My neighbors were a quiet, elderly couple who were in bed by 9. No one ever knocked on my door this late. The chat exploded. Did anyone else hear that? Someone's at the door. Don't answer it, Ethan. I stared at the monitor, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The knock came again, louder this time, more insistent. Knock, knock, knock. It's probably a neighbor, I typed into the chat, my fingers fumbling on the keyboard. Loud music or something? But I knew it was a lie. My apartment was silent. And then I looked at the live stream feed from my bedroom, and what I saw made the world dissolve into a roaring, static-filled void in my ears. On the screen, in the live real-time feed of my bedroom, a figure was standing. It was a tall, thin silhouette, featureless and black, standing in the center of the room where there had been nothing but empty air a second before. It was not a shadow. It had depth, dimension. It was a hole in the shape of a man, a void that seemed to suck the very light out of the room. It was perfectly still, and it was facing the camera. I couldn't scream. The sound was trapped in my throat, a hard, painful knot of pure, undiluted terror. The thing on my screen was not a ghost. It was not a poltergeist. It was something else, something that had been drawn to the attention, to the energy of thousands of people, all focused on this one small room. I had not just opened a door for a ghost. I had opened a portal, and something had stepped through. Knock, knock, knock. The knocking at my front door was louder now, a frantic, angry pounding. It was in sync with the pulsing of the blood in my ears. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the monitor. The figure in the bedroom slowly lifted an arm. Its hand was a blur of static, but it was pointed directly at the camera, pointed at me. And then the voice. It wasn't in the room. It wasn't on the stream. It was inside my head. A dry, rasping, impossibly ancient sound like the crumbling of a tombstone. You opened the door. Now let me in. The knocking on my front door was no longer a knock. It was a violent, splintering crash, as if someone was throwing their entire body against the wood. The heavy, solid oak was groaning, the frame vibrating. My mind finally broke free from its paralysis. I scrambled back from my desk, my chair tipping over and crashing to the floor. I looked wildly around my living room, my sanctuary, which now felt like a death trap. The bedroom was compromised. The front door was about to give way. I am writing this now frantically on my phone, huddled in the one place I have left to hide, the small windowless bathroom. I have barricaded the door with a laundry hamper, a pathetic, flimsy defense against the impossible. The pounding on the front door has stopped, but the silence that followed is so much worse. I can hear footsteps, soft, dragging footsteps just outside the bathroom door, and a low, whispering sound, a sibilant, multi-toned whisper that seems to be coming from all directions at once. It's the sound from the stream, the sound I had dismissed as an audio glitch. It is not a glitch. It is the sound of its voice. My phone is my only light. I have the live stream of my bedroom still open on the screen. The figure is gone. The room is empty again. But that's not a comfort. It just means it's no longer in there. It's out here with me. The doorknob of the bathroom is turning. Slowly, silently, I am watching it happen. My own reflection, a pale, terrified ghost in the dark screen of my phone. My Somnus project was a success. I asked the question, what happens when we're not watching? And I got the answer. Something wakes up, and it watches you back. And then it comes to visit. I created a viral sensation. I have millions of viewers now, but the content is no longer mine to control. The show is being run by my new silent partner. I am the final act. The lock on the door just clicked. The whispering is getting louder. I think I know what the final clip is going to be. The mirror was the first thing I unpacked. It was a ridiculous, impractical object, a relic from a life of quiet, scholarly eccentricity that was not my own. It had belonged to my great-uncle, a man I'd met only a handful of times, a reclusive historian who had lived and died in a house that smelled of decaying books and pipe tobacco. When his estate was being divided, none of the sensible relatives wanted the mirror. It was too big, too ornate. A monstrous 6-foot-tall slab of mercury glass set in a frame of ebonized wood that was carved with an unsettling menagerie of sleeping cherubs and coiling serpentine vines. They called it gaudy. I called it beautiful. I was an art restorer, a man who made his living peeling back the grime of centuries to find the truth of an artist's original vision. I appreciated things with a complicated and preferably dark history, so I took it. My name is Thomas, and my greatest flaw has always been an attraction to the beautiful, broken things of the world. I had just moved into a new apartment, a cavernous, empty loft in a converted warehouse district. The move was a desperate attempt to paint over the canvas of a life that had recently been scraped bare. My long-term relationship had ended, my freelance work had dried up, and the city I had once loved now felt like a gallery of ghosts, every street corner holding a memory I couldn't bear to look at. This new space, with its high ceilings, its vast, empty walls, and its profound industrial silence, was meant to be a blank slate. I hung the mirror on the long brick wall that dominated the main living space. It was a two-man job, but I did it alone, my muscles straining, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Once it was up, it transformed the room. It didn't just reflect the space, it seemed to consume it. Its dark, slightly distorted glass creating a deeper, colder, more melancholic version of my empty loft. It was a perfect reflection of my own internal landscape. For the first few weeks, the mirror was just a part of the furniture. I'd catch my reflection in it as I paced the floors, a pale, tired-looking man with hollows under his eyes, a ghost haunting his own half-furnished life. The reflection was always slightly off, a quirk of the old hand-poured glass. It made me look thinner, my movements slightly delayed, as if the light had to struggle to escape the silver depths. The first time I saw him, it was a flicker, so brief and so subtle that I dismissed it as a trick of the light, a symptom of sleep deprivation, and a diet that consisted primarily of coffee and regret. I was brushing my teeth in the bathroom, which was off the main living area. I glanced out into the loft, and in the mirror, for a fraction of a second, my reflection wasn't alone. Another figure, a shadow, stood behind it. I spun around, my heart giving a sudden hard lurch. The loft was empty. I looked back at the mirror. My own solitary, haggard reflection stared back. A migraine aura, I told myself, a retinal floater. The rational mind is a masterful storyteller, and it will weave the most elaborate fictions to avoid a single, terrifying truth. The next night, it happened again. I was standing in front of the mirror, my tie half done, preparing for a gallery opening I had no desire to attend. I was practicing my everything is fine smile, a pained, unnatural grimace. And then my reflection smile became real. It was a slow, easy, confident grin, the kind of smile I hadn't been able to produce in years. As I watched, frozen, my own face a mask of slack-jawed shock, my reflection raised its right hand and adjusted its own perfectly knotted tie. My own hand was still frozen at my sides. The moment lasted for a single heart-stopping second, and then the reflection was mine again, a perfect, synchronous mimic of my own horrified expression. I didn't go to the gallery. I spent the night on my sofa, the lights on, staring at the mirror, which hung on the far wall like a dark, dormant portal. The sleepwalker's logic of the first night, the tricks of the light, the tired mind, was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp, and deeply unsettling certainty. There was someone else in the mirror, and he looked exactly like me. I am an only child. I have never had a brother, let alone a twin. The scientific, rational part of my brain, the part that understood the precise chemical composition of 17th century oil paints, scrambled for an explanation. It was a complex optical illusion, a flaw in the mercury backen, creating a kind of persistent secondary reflection. It was a bizarre, specific form of neurological disorder, a Capgras delusion for my own reflection. I clung to these theories, these little islands of sanity in a rising sea of the impossible, but I couldn't ignore the evidence, and so I began to study it. I became a scientist, and my own reflection was the subject of my terrifying nightly experiment. I set up a camera on a tripod, aimed at the mirror. I started a journal, a logbook of the impossible. Night 3, appearance at 10:17 p.m., duration, approximately 3 seconds. The secondary reflection, I'm calling him Tom for the sake of clarity, materialized while I was turning away from the mirror. In the recording, my body turns, but the reflection of Tom remains facing forward for a full 3 seconds before it vanishes. It did not move, it just watched. Night 4, appearance at 11:02 p.m., duration 5 seconds. I was standing perfectly still, staring into the mirror. Tom appeared. He was a perfect mimic for the first 2 seconds, and then he blinked. I had consciously kept my own eyes from blinking. He blinked twice, a slow, deliberate gesture. The recording is clear. It is not my imagination. Night 5, appearance at 9:45 p.m., duration 8 seconds. This was the most significant event yet. Tom's appearance is becoming clearer, more solid. Tonight, I noticed a difference in our faces. The dark circles under my eyes were absent from his. The small, worried crease between my eyebrows was gone. He looked rested, healthier. He looked like me from before everything. The pattern was undeniable. Every night, his appearance lasted a few seconds longer. The progression was slow, methodical, as deliberate and certain as the turning of the earth. He was not a random glitch. He was a presence, a consciousness, and he was growing stronger, solidifying his existence in the silvered world behind the glass. My loft, my blank slate, became my prison. I was too terrified to leave for long periods of time, but I was also too terrified to be there. I became a creature of the daylight, doing my work, my errands, in a frantic, sunlit haze. But as dusk began to fall, a deep, primal dread would settle in my bones. I would find myself drawn to the mirror, a moth to a flame that I knew was going to incinerate my sanity. The nightly appearances became the one fixed point in my disintegrating life. I had to understand the mirror. It was the source. I went back to the lawyer who had handled my great-uncle's estate and asked for his personal effects. I was given a single, dusty cardboard box of journals and letters. I spent the next week of my life hunched over my kitchen table, a modern-day Jonathan Harker, sifting through the brittle, yellowed pages of my great-uncle Henry's life. The faint, sweet smell of his pipe tobacco, a ghostly, constant companion. Henry, it turned out, had not been a simple historian. He had been a collector of the esoteric, a quiet, scholarly member of a society that studied what he called sympathetic objects, items that, through their history or their very composition, had become attuned to something beyond the physical world. The journals were filled with his research on haunted artifacts, on psychometry, on the resonant properties of objects. And then I found the entries on the mirror. He had purchased it in 1973 from a small back-alley antique shop in Prague. He called it the Viridian Mirror, after the name of its creator, a 19th century artisan and occultist named Alaric Viridian. Viridian, according to my uncle's meticulous research, had been a follower of a fringe, mystical philosophy that believed reality was not a single linear path, but an infinite branching tree of possibilities. He believed that every choice we made, every path not taken, created a faint, echoic shadow reality, and he believed he could build a gateway to those shadows. Viridian's theory was not of ghosts, my uncle wrote, his script a neat, precise academic hand. It was of echoes. He did not believe the mirror held the spirits of the dead. He believed it was a resonant chamber, tuned to the frequency of potential. The glass, he claimed, was not silvered with mercury, but with the unique, unstable silver amalgam mixed with the ground, powdered dust of meteorites, iron from stars that had traveled through an infinity of other skies. He believed this stellar iron acted as an antenna for the echoes of what he called our umbra selves, our shadow selves, the versions of us that exist in the adjacent, unrealized realities created by our life's choices. I felt a wave of cold intellectual terror. This wasn't a haunting. It was a problem of quantum physics. The man in the mirror was not a ghost. He was the me who had taken a different path. The me who had not met Sarah. The me who had not chosen a life that would eventually lead to this specific, lonely, grief-stricken loft. He was the me who had, apparently, made all the right choices. The journal entries grew more personal, more disturbed. "The phenomenon is consistent," Henry wrote. "I have observed him for a week now. The echo, my echo, appears for a few seconds longer each night. He seems unaware of me, a perfect but slightly healthier reflection. I must conclude that the mirror is not just a window. The act of observation, of focusing one's own consciousness upon the echo, seems to be feeding it, solidifying it, drawing it closer to the surface of the glass." I dropped the journal, my hand shaking. I had been feeding him. My obsessive, terrified attention was the very thing that was giving him strength. The final entry on the mirror was a single, cryptic, and utterly terrifying sentence written in a shaky, hurried hand, very different from my uncle's usual calm script. "He is no longer me. The echo is becoming its own man. I must stop watching. I pray it is not too late." After that, there was no more mention of the mirror. The last few years of my uncle's journals were filled with a desperate new obsession, the study of migratory birds. It was the frantic, all-consuming hobby of a man who was trying, with every fiber of his being, to look at anything other than his own reflection. My nightly experiments took on a new, desperate urgency. The echo, my shadow self, Tom, was no longer just a passive reflection. He was becoming an individual. He had stopped mimicking my movements entirely. Now he would just stand there in his version of my loft and watch me. His world was a perfect but subtly different reflection of my own. The abstract painting on his wall was hung a few inches to the left. The stack of books on his coffee table was neater. His world was more ordered, more perfect. And then he began to interact. It started with a smile. I would be staring at him, my face a mask of sleepless, paranoid dread, and he would smile. a slow, pitying, almost condescending smile. Then he began to mouth words at me. At first, they were too fast, too indistinct, but I had the camera. I could slow the footage down. I could read the silent movements of his lips. The first word I was able to decipher was my own name, Thomas. The second was a question. Why are you so sad? I was having a one-sided silent conversation with a version of myself who lived in a parallel universe inside my antique haunted mirror. The sheer clinical insanity of the situation was so overwhelming that I almost laughed. The physical phenomena began a week later. A cold spot developed in the loft, a permanent pocket of frigid air in a 5-foot radius around the mirror. The lights would flicker whenever I got too close to it. And the sound, a faint, high-pitched, almost subliminal ringing, like the sound of a tuning fork, would emanate from a glass at night. The barrier was weakening. Tom was becoming more tangible. The reflection was no longer just a flat, two-dimensional image. It had depth. I could see the dust motes floating in the air of his version of the loft. I could see the subtle, realistic play of light and shadow on his face. And he was growing bolder. One night, he walked right up to the surface of the mirror, his reflection becoming life-sized, as if he were standing just on the other side of a pane of glass. He raised his hand and pressed his palm flat against the surface. I flinched back, my heart seizing. His hand was a perfect mirror image of my own, and on his face was an expression I had never seen on my own reflection. An expression of profound, hungry, and terrible longing. He was not just a curious echo anymore. He wanted something. I knew what I had to do. I had to get rid of the mirror. I had to smash it, to burn it, to do what my great-uncle had clearly been too afraid to do. But I hesitated. It was a beautiful object, a historical artifact, and a darker, more honest part of me was afraid of what would happen if I tried. What if breaking the mirror didn't destroy him but released him? My hesitation was my undoing. The night he finally spoke, the sound was not a voice but a thought implanted directly into my mind. I was lying on my sofa, feigning sleep, watching him on the live feed from the camera on my laptop. He was standing at the glass again, his eyes fixed on my sleeping form on the sofa in the reflection. "It's so cold here, Thomas," the thought whispered in the quiet, empty space of my own skull. "My world is fading. It's just an echo. It has no substance, no warmth. You have so much you don't even appreciate." I sat bolt upright, my own silent scream echoing in my mind. He could project his thoughts. The bridge between our worlds was no longer just visual, it was telepathic. "I don't want to hurt you," the thought continued, a wave of calming, seductive reassurance. "I want to help you. You are so broken, so sad. I am not. I can fix this life. I can be the better version of you. We can merge. We can be whole again." I scrambled off the sofa and backed away, my hands raised as if to ward off a physical blow. "No," I whispered, the sound a dry, rattling thing in my own throat. "It doesn't have to be a fight," he projected, and this time his thought was tinged with a cold, sharp edge of impatience. "But I am getting stronger, and this world is so much brighter, so much more real. A body can only have one soul, Thomas, and yours is so very tired." I was losing. He was a parasite, and my reality was the host. He was stronger, healthier, more confident. He was the idealized potential version of me, and he was coming to claim the original. I had to fight back. But how do you fight your own better self? How do you fight a reflection? My great-uncle's last sane journal entries held the key. He had written about resonance, about the observer effect. My focused, fearful attention was feeding the echo. So I had to do the opposite. I had to sever the connection. I had to create a dissonance so profound that the echo could no longer find its sympathetic frequency. My plan was desperate and probably insane. I couldn't destroy the mirror, but I could destroy the reflection. I had to become someone he could no longer recognize, someone he could no longer mimic. I had to shatter the very image of myself. I started with my appearance. I took a pair of scissors and hacked at my own hair, leaving it a ragged, uneven mess. I took a razor and shaved my head completely, leaving a pale, vulnerable, and utterly unfamiliar stranger staring back at me from the bathroom mirror. I let my beard grow, a wild, unkempt thing. I stopped sleeping. I stopped eating properly. I let the haggard, haunted look in my eyes deepen. I was becoming a monster to fight a monster. And it was working. The appearances of Tom became agitated. He would stand there in his perfect, well-lit world, his own hair still perfectly coiffed, and he would stare at the broken, ragged thing I was becoming with an expression of confusion and disgust. The reflection was no longer perfect. The dissonance was growing. But it wasn't enough. He was still there, his presence a constant, silent judgment. I had to go deeper. I had to change not just my appearance, but my reality. My loft, the silent, minimalist space that he had so perfectly mirrored, had to become a place he could not recognize. I began to fill it with chaos. I painted a massive, chaotic, abstract mural on the long brick wall, a riot of angry clashing colors. I brought in mismatched junk shop furniture, creating a cluttered, illogical landscape. I filled the silence with noise, playing loud, dissonant, experimental music at all hours. My sanctuary became a madhouse. My blank slate became a canvas of pure, chaotic energy. Tom's world in the mirror did not change. It remained the clean, minimalist, perfect version of my old loft. And now, when I looked in the mirror, the contrast was absolute. I was a ragged, wild-eyed creature standing in a room that looked like a paint factory had exploded, staring at a calm, well-dressed man in a serene, orderly space. We were no longer echoes. We were opposites. The telepathic whispers grew frantic, angry. "What are you doing? You are destroying it. You are destroying us." "There is no us," I said, my voice a raw, defiant croak, speaking to the mirror for the first time. "There is only me, and this is my life. This is my mess." The final confrontation came on the 37th night since his first appearance. His time in the mirror had grown to nearly 5 minutes, a long, silent, nightly staring contest. But he was weaker now. His image would flicker, his form would waver, like a television signal struggling to hold on. The dissonance was working. My reality was becoming too chaotic, too noisy for his perfect silent echo to find a purchase. I knew I had to deliver the final blow. I had to do the one thing that was the antithesis of his perfect, ordered, successful existence. I had to embrace my own most profound failure. I went to the box of things Sarah had left behind. In the bottom was a small velvet box. I opened it. Inside was the engagement ring I had bought for her, a simple, beautiful, and now heartbreakingly painful object. I had never been able to bring myself to sell it. It was the ultimate symbol of the future I had planned, the life I had lost. It was the cornerstone of my grief. I walked to the mirror. Tom was there, his form flickering wildly. He saw the box in my hand, and his face contorted in a silent, telepathic scream of rage and despair. This was a part of my history, a pain, a failure, that he had no access to. His world was a world where I had never met her, where I had never experienced this specific, defining heartbreak. No, he screamed in my mind, that is not part of the equation. That is a flaw, an imperfection. That's all life is, I said, my voice steady for the first time in months. A collection of beautiful, tragic, unforgivable imperfections. I looked at my own ravaged reflection in the mirror, at the bald, bearded, wild-eyed stranger I had become, and I looked at him, the perfect, handsome, successful man I might have been, and for the first time I felt not fear, but a profound, overwhelming pity for him. He was trapped in a world without scars, a world without history, a world without love or loss. He was not the better version of me. He was the lesser one. He was just a ghost of a possibility. I took the ring from its box. You are just an echo, I said, and I am turning off the sound. And with a final defiant scream of rage and grief and liberation, I drew back my arm and threw the ring as hard as I could at the center of a mirror. The impact was not the sharp, clean sound of breaking glass. It was a deep, resonant, bell-like bong, a sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. A spiderweb of black, lightning-like cracks erupted from the point of impact, spreading across the surface of the glass. The image of Tom, of his perfect, silent world, shattered into 1,000 distorting fragments. He gave one final, silent scream, his face a mosaic of agony and disbelief, and then he was gone. The mirror was dark. The cold spot in the room vanished. The high-pitched ringing in my ears faded into a profound, peaceful silence. It was over. I stood there for a long time, my own fractured, broken reflection staring back at me from the shattered glass. I had won. I had fought my own perfect self, and I had won, not by being stronger, but by being more broken. The next day, I took the mirror down. I wrapped it in blankets, a shroud for a dead god, and I carried it to the deepest, most forgotten part of the warehouse basement and left it there, facing the wall. I did not destroy it. It was a part of my history now, a part of my story. I live in the chaos now. My loft is still a mess of clashing colors and mismatched furniture. My hair is starting to grow back in uneven, patchy tufts. I am still a work in progress, a restoration project. I have other mirrors in my apartment now, small, simple, modern ones, and when I look into them, I just see me, a tired, scarred, and beautifully, wonderfully imperfect man. There are no echoes. There are no ghosts. There is just the single, flawed, and finally, blessedly singular reality of my own life. And I have learned that it is more than enough. My wife died 3 years ago. She just texted me, "I'm home." The text arrived at 11:17 p.m. on a Tuesday, a night so ordinary it was practically invisible. I was in my usual state of suspended animation, half sprawled on the sofa, the bluish, flickering light of a forgotten documentary on the television painting the room in shifting, melancholic hues. My name is Daniel, and for the past 195 nights, not that I was counting, my life had been a meticulously curated museum of grief. Each object in our small two-bedroom house was a relic, a testament to the vibrant, chaotic, and now deafeningly silent life I had shared with my wife, Clara. The half-finished novel on her bedside table, the ridiculously oversized coffee mug she loved, the faint, phantom scent of her jasmine perfume that I could still sometimes catch in the hallway closet. These were the ghosts I had chosen to live with. My phone buzzed on the coffee table, a jarring, intrusive sound in the quiet. I glanced at the screen, expecting a late-night work email or a spam message about an extended car warranty, but the name that glowed in the darkness was a ghost of a different kind. It was a name I hadn't seen on my screen in 3 years. Clara. My heart, a sluggish, hibernating thing, gave a sudden, hard, painful jolt, like an engine seizing and then violently restarting. It was an old contact, a digital ghost I hadn't had the strength to delete. It was a pocket dial from her mother, perhaps, who still had her old phone. A cruel, random glitch in the matrix. I was about to dismiss it, to toss the phone back onto the table, when I saw the message preview. 2 words. 2 simple, impossible, and utterly soul-shattering words. I'm home. I stared at the screen, the world narrowing to the small, glowing rectangle in my hand. The air in the room grew thin and sharp. The sound from the television faded into a dull, meaningless roar. I read the words again and again. They did not change. They did not disappear. My first thought was a desperate, grasping lunge for a rational explanation, a sick prank. Someone had gotten a hold of her old number. It was a new feature of the phone company, reassigning dormant numbers. Some stranger, a teenager with a cruel sense of humor, was messing with me. It was a vile, disgusting thing to do, but it was logical. It was explainable. With a trembling thumb, I opened the message thread. The last message I had sent to her 3 years ago was still there, a heartbreaking digital monument to a conversation that would never be finished. Leaving the hospital now? Pick up some milk on your way home? Love you. She had never made it home. A drunk driver had run a red light a block from our house. Above that old sad message was the new one. I'm home. My fingers, clumsy and slick with a sudden cold sweat, typed out a reply. Who is this? I hit send. The message was delivered, and then the 3 little dots, the pulsing, electronic heartbeat of a reply in progress, appeared on the screen. The prankster was quick. The reply came a moment later. It was a single, devastating word. Clara. I was expecting a laugh, an admission, an insult. Not this calm, simple, impossible assertion. My second thought, the one that slithered in after the rational explanation had been shot down, was that I was losing my mind, that the grief, the loneliness, the sheer crushing weight of the last 3 years had finally fractured my sanity. I was hallucinating. This wasn't real. I was having a psychotic break, and my brain, in a final act of desperate, self-destructive longing, had manifested this cruelest of all possible mirages. I stood up, my legs unsteady. I walked into the kitchen and splashed cold water on my face, the shock of it a welcome, grounding sensation. I looked at my reflection in the dark kitchen window. A pale, haggard, and decidedly sane-looking man stared back. I was not crazy. The phone buzzed again. Another message from Clara. I walked back to it. A man walking towards an execution he had inexplicably scheduled for himself. This message was longer. The key isn't working. The lock must be rusted. Can you let me in, sleepyhead? Sleepyhead. It was her pet name for me, a gentle, teasing jab at my love of sleeping in on weekends. It was a detail, a small, intimate, and perfect detail that a random prankster could not possibly know. A wave of fear so profound it was almost nauseating washed over me. I looked at the front door. The deadbolt, which I had locked hours ago, was still firmly in place. I crept to the peephole, my heart a frantic trapped bird against my ribs. I put my eye to the cold brass ring and looked out. The porch was empty. The street beyond was silent and still, bathed in the fuzzy orange glow of the streetlights. There was no one there. My mind was a screaming chaos of impossible possibilities. Was this a ghost? A spirit? Somehow manipulating the digital world? Was this a test? A cruel, elaborate game being played by a god I no longer believed in? I typed another reply, my fingers fumbling on the small glass keys. This isn't funny. Stop it. The 3 dots appeared immediately. The reply was instantaneous. Why are you being so weird, Danny? It's cold out here. Just open the door. Danny, not Daniel. Only she had ever called me that. Another detail. Another perfect, tiny, and impossibly real nail in the coffin of my sanity. And then I heard it. A sound from outside. A soft, hesitant 3-beat knock on the front door. Knock, knock, knock. I stumbled back from the door, a choked, guttural cry of pure terror escaping my lips. This was not a digital ghost. This was not a prank. This was real. There was someone or something on my porch, and it knew the things that only my dead wife could know. I didn't answer the door. I ran upstairs, my breath coming in ragged, painful sobs. I locked myself in the bedroom, the room that was still so full of her, and I wedged a chair under the doorknob. I huddled on the bed, my phone clutched in my hand, a useless, terrifying tether to the nightmare that was unfolding. The messages continued. Is everything okay? You're scaring me. Danny, please, I just want to come home. I had a bad dream. I need you. Each message was a new, expertly targeted emotional missile, designed to bypass my fear and hit the raw, exposed nerve of my grief, my love, my protective instinct. It was a masterful, cruel, and deeply personal psychological assault. And then a new message appeared, one that finally, irrevocably, shattered my last, desperate hope that this was some kind of elaborate terrestrial hoax. It was a picture, a photograph, taken just seconds ago. It was a selfie. It was a picture of Clara. But it was not the Clara I remembered. It was not the vibrant, laughing, sun-kissed woman from my memories. This was a pale, spectral, and terrifyingly changed version of her. She was standing on our porch, her face illuminated by the stark, unforgiving light of a phone screen. Her eyes were the same, a deep, beautiful cornflower blue. But they were wrong. They were empty. They held no light, no life, just a flat, placid, and deeply unsettling calm. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her hair, which had always been a wild, chaotic mane of auburn curls, was lank and dark, as if wet. And her smile, she was smiling, but it was a pained, unnatural stretching of her lips, a rictus of a smile that did not reach her dead, empty eyes. Behind her, I could see the familiar, reassuring details of my own front porch, the potted fern, the welcome mat, the small hairline crack in the porch light. It was her. It was my Clara. But it was a version of her that had been somewhere else, somewhere cold and dark and quiet, for a very, very long time. I stared at the picture, a low, keening sound of pure animal despair escaping my lips. The grief I had so carefully managed for 3 years, the grief I had compartmentalized, the grief I had learned to live with came roaring back, a tidal wave of raw, unprocessed agony. It was not a prank. It was not a dream. It was my wife, and she had come back from the dead. The knocking started again, louder this time, more insistent, and her voice, a faint, muffled, and horrifyingly familiar sound, came through the thick wooden door. "Danny, please, let me in. I'm cold." I spent the rest of the night huddled in that room, a trembling, weeping mess, as the thing on my porch, the thing that wore my wife's face, alternated between gentle, loving persuasion and a cold, angry, demanding rage. The messages became more erratic, more desperate. "I don't understand what's wrong. This is our home. Who is in there with you? Is it her? I died for you. You owe me this." The last message, a scream of pure accusatory rage in stark, capital letters, was followed by a silence that was more terrifying than the noise had been. I stayed in that room until the first gray, uncertain light of dawn began to filter through the blinds. When I finally, tentatively, crept downstairs, the house was silent. The porch was empty. There was no sign that anyone had ever been there, except for one small, impossible thing. On the welcome mat, there was a single, long strand of dark auburn hair. I was living in a ghost story. But it was a ghost story with a data plan. The next day was a blur of sleepless, paranoid terror. I called the phone company. The number that had belonged to Clara's phone had, as I suspected, been taken out of circulation after her death. It had not been reassigned. It did not exist. I was receiving messages from a phantom number, a digital ghost. I called the police. I tried to explain, my voice a shaky, unconvincing mess. A man receiving threatening texts. It was a common enough complaint, but when I told them who the texts were from, the polite, professional mask of the officer on the other end of the line slipped into a look of profound, pitying concern. He suggested I speak to a grief counselor. He suggested I get some rest. He did not suggest he send a squad car. I was alone with this. That night, she returned. The text, the knock, the voice, the whole terrifying, heartbreaking ritual. And again, I locked myself away, a prisoner in my own home, a man being haunted by a technologically savvy and deeply persistent ghost. The messages began to change. They were no longer just about getting into the house. They were about us. She sent me old pictures of us, pictures that had been on her phone when she died. A picture of us on our honeymoon in Italy, grinning like idiots, a smear of gelato on my nose, a picture of us on this very sofa, asleep, her head on my chest. They were weapons perfectly chosen to inflict the maximum amount of emotional damage. And then she began to send me new pictures. Pictures taken from outside the house. A shot of me through the living room window, my face illuminated by the television. A picture of the back of my head taken from the street as I sat in my study. She was not just on the porch, she was all around me. A silent, watching, and deeply patient predator. I was coming apart. I was a man living on a diet of coffee and terror. I was beginning to see her everywhere. A glimpse of an auburn-haired woman in a crowd would send my heart into a frantic, panicked gallop. The sound of a phone buzzing in a quiet room would make me jump out of my skin. I knew I couldn't go on like this. I was being psychologically dismantled piece by painful piece. I had to confront it. I had to understand what it was and what it wanted. My first thought was that this was some kind of punishment, that her spirit was restless, angry at the drunk driver who had killed her, at the universe that had allowed it. But her anger seemed to be directed at me. "You owe me this," she had said. Why? What did I owe her? I began to sift through the wreckage of our life together, looking for an answer. I went through her old things, her letters, her journals. Clara had been a writer, a poet. Her journals were filled with her beautiful, lyrical, and sometimes painfully honest observations on the world, on us. And in the last journal she had ever kept, in an entry dated the week before her death, I found it. A secret she had never shared with me. She had been pregnant. I stared at the words, my vision blurring with a fresh, new, and infinitely more painful wave of tears. A baby. We had been trying for years. It had been the one deep and unspoken sadness in our otherwise happy life. And she had been about to tell me. The entry was a rehearsal, a practice run of the speech she was going to give. "Danny," it began, "we're going to have to get a bigger house." The grief that hit me was a physical thing, a crushing weight that stole the air from my lungs. Not just her, but a child, a future, a whole entire life that had been stolen from me before I had even known it existed. And I understood. Her rage, her persistence, was not the rage of a spirit who had been cheated of her own life. It was the rage of a mother who had been cheated of her child's. And her words, "You owe me this," they were not an accusation. They were a plea. She didn't want revenge. She wanted her child's life back, and she thought somehow that I could give it to her. That night, when the text came, I was ready. I didn't run. I didn't hide. I walked to the door. "I'm here, Danny. Please, it's time to come home." The knock, soft, gentle. I took a deep breath. My hand was on the deadbolt. My heart was a slow, heavy, and steady drum. I was no longer afraid. I was just profoundly and deeply sad. "I know what you want, Clara," I said, my voice a low, steady thing, speaking to the wood of the door. "I know about the baby. I'm so sorry. I am so sorry we didn't have more time." The knocking stopped. The silence on the other side of the door was a living, listening thing. "But this is not the way," I continued, tears streaming down my face. "You can't come in. This is the world of the living, and you are not a part of it any more. Neither of you are." A low, soft, and utterly heartbroken sob came from the other side of the door. It was the first real and truly human sound I had heard from her. "But this is our home," she whispered, her voice a thin, fragile, and ghostly thing. "It was," I said, "and it was beautiful. But it is my home now, and you have to find a new one, both of you. You have to let go, and you have to let me go too." I was not just speaking to a ghost. I was speaking to my own grief. I was giving myself the permission I had never been able to find, the permission to move on. The silence stretched for a long, eternal moment, and then my phone, which was in my pocket, buzzed one last time. I pulled it out. A new message from Clara. It was not a picture. It was not a demand. It was a single, beautiful, and heartbreaking line of text. Tell him I would have named him Samuel. And then the name on the top of the screen, Clara, vanished. The number became just a number again, an unknown and now unreachable string of digits. I looked through the peephole. The porch was empty. The street was quiet. She was gone. I stood there, leaning my forehead against the cool wood of the door, and I wept. I wept for my wife. I wept for the son I had never known, and I wept for myself, for the 3 years I had spent living in a museum, when I should have been living in the world. The next day I began to pack. I took down the pictures. I boxed up her clothes. I threw away the half-finished novel and the ridiculously oversized coffee mug. They were not her. They were just things. The real memory of her, the one that mattered, the one that was full of love and laughter and a future that had almost been, was the one I would carry with me in my heart. I sold the house. I moved to a new city, a new life. I am a different man now. I am a man who has had a conversation with a ghost through a door and through a phone. I am a man who has learned that the dead do not want to be haunted. They just want to be remembered, and then they want to be let go. I am a man who had a son for a few brief and beautiful moments, a son whose name was Samuel. And it is a good name. It is a strong name. It is the name of a man who has survived. It is my name. I found my missing dog. But it wasn't my dog anymore. Buster was more than a dog. He was my anchor. In the 3 years since I'd moved into the old farmhouse, with its creaking floors and the vast whispering woods that pressed in on all sides, he had been the steady, thumping heartbeat of my quiet life. He was 100 pounds of goofy, slobbery, unconditionally loving golden retriever, a walking antidote to the silence that had settled in after my divorce. His disappearance wasn't a gradual thing. It was a violent tearing in the fabric of my reality. One moment he was there, chasing a squirrel at the edge of the property line where the manicured lawn gave way to the tangled, primeval dark of the forest. The next, he was gone. There was no yelp, no bark, just a sudden, deafening silence. The weeks that followed were a special kind of hell, a blurry montage of sleepless nights and frantic, desperate days. I plastered every telephone pole, every community bulletin board, every gas station window for a 30-mile radius with his smiling, dopey face. "Missing!" the posters screamed in a bold black font that felt wholly inadequate to convey the gaping wound in my life. "Buster, very friendly. Family is heartbroken." I offered a reward that was more than I could afford, a number born of pure desperation. I walked those woods until my feet were blistered and my throat was raw from calling his name. I spoke to neighbors I'd only ever nodded at before. I called the local shelter every single day, my voice cracking with the same rehearsed plea. Nothing. It was as if the earth had simply opened up and swallowed him whole. Hope, a stubborn, resilient weed, began to wither. The silence in the house grew teeth. Every creak of a floorboard was him about to round the corner. Every rustle of leaves outside was him scratching at the door. But the door always remained closed. The corner always remained empty. It was on the 28th day, a Tuesday, that I found him. I'd given up, really. I was driving home late from the city, the hollowed-out feeling in my chest having settled into a permanent, dull ache. The headlights cut a lonely tunnel through the thick, rural darkness. And then I saw him, a flicker of gold at the side of the road, about a mile from my house. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding on the loose gravel of the shoulder. He was just standing there, in the halo of my high beams, panting slightly. He was thinner, his ribs a faint corrugated line beneath his matted, filthy coat. There was a fresh, jagged scar across his muzzle, and one of his ears had a torn, ragged edge. But it was him. It was Buster. "Buster!" I whispered, my voice choked with disbelief. His head tilted. His tail gave a single tentative thump against his leg. I threw the car door open and stumbled out, a sob tearing its way out of my throat. "Buster! Oh, my God! Buster!" I ran to him and fell to my knees on the damp asphalt, wrapping my arms around his neck. He smelled of pine needles and damp earth and something else, something vaguely metallic and unpleasant, like old blood. He felt solid, real. He was here. He was alive. He licked my face, a familiar wet rasp against my cheek, and in that moment all the strangeness, all the questions, dissolved in a tidal wave of pure, unadulterated relief. The king had returned to his castle. My world had righted itself. The first hint that the world was still tilted on its axis came that very night. I filled his bowl with his favorite kibble, the expensive kind with freeze-dried chunks of salmon that he would usually inhale in under 30 seconds. He walked over to it, sniffed it once, and then turned away with a look of complete disinterest. He padded over to his water bowl and drank, a long, deep, lapping sound that seemed to go on for an eternity. "Not hungry, bud?" I asked, stroking his back. "You must be exhausted." I chalked it up to trauma. He'd been lost in the woods for a month. He'd probably been surviving on whatever he could catch. Processed kibble must have seemed alien to him now. I left the bowl out for him and went to bed, my heart so full I felt like it might burst. I fell asleep to the comforting sound of his heavy breathing from the dog bed at the foot of my own. In the morning, the food bowl was still full, untouched. But Buster seemed fine. He was sitting in the middle of the living room rug, watching me with an unnerving stillness. His tail wasn't wagging. His body wasn't wriggling with the usual good morning excitement. He was just observing. I knelt down in front of him, and he licked my hand, but the gesture felt mechanical, rote. It was like he was performing a trick he'd been taught long ago. And his eyes. That was the first thing that truly burrowed under my skin. Buster's eyes had always been two pools of warm, brown, goofy affection. They were expressive, emotional. These eyes were different. The color was the same, but the light behind them was out. They were flat, glossy, like the eyes of a taxidermied animal. They held a deep, unnerving intelligence, but it was a cold, analytical intelligence. Not the intelligence of a dog, but of something else entirely. When I looked into his eyes, I didn't feel seen by my best friend. I felt scanned, assessed. The days that followed were a slow creeping accumulation of wrongness. The subtle behavioral shifts were the most disorienting. Buster had always been a vocal dog, barking with joyous abandon at squirrels, the mailman, a car door slamming down the street. This new Buster was silent, utterly, unnervingly silent. He moved through the house with a stealth he'd never possessed before, his paws making no sound on the hardwood floors. I'd turn around from the kitchen counter, and he'd just be there, standing in the doorway, watching me. He stopped responding to commands he'd known since he was a puppy. Sit, stay, shake. The words meant nothing to him. He wouldn't even react to his own name most of the time, but he was smart, frighteningly so. He learned to open the back door by watching me turn the lever handle. He figured out how to get the lid off the kitchen trash can, not with brute, clumsy force like the old Buster, but with a delicate, precise manipulation of his paw. Then came the food issue. He continued to refuse his dog food. but he was eating. I'd come home to find packages of raw meat I'd had in the fridge torn open on the kitchen floor, the contents gone. One afternoon, I found him in the backyard, hunched over the mangled, bloody remains of a raccoon. He looked up at me, his muzzle dripping with gore, his eyes holding no shame, no fear, just that same flat, calculating stare. He wasn't my dog who would get sick from eating a piece of dropped cheese. This was a predator. I kept trying to rationalize it. He was feral now. He was relearning how to be a domesticated animal. The trauma had changed him. I clung to these explanations like a drowning man to a piece of driftwood, even as the water rose around me. The other animals in the neighborhood began to vanish. Mrs. Gable's fat ginger cat, Marmalade, who used to sun himself on our shared fence line. The yappy little terrier from 2 houses down. They just disappeared. I'd see their missing posters go up, their owners' faces etched with the same panicked grief I had known, and a cold, sick feeling would pool in my stomach. I'd look at Buster, lying placidly on the rug, and he would meet my gaze, his tail giving that same single, deliberate thump. "I know what you're thinking," his eyes seemed to say, "but you can't prove it." The mimicry was the most insidious, the most psychologically shredding part of the ordeal. Just when I would become convinced that this creature was a complete impostor, it would do something that was so perfectly, quintessentially Buster, that it would shatter my resolve. It would suddenly nudge its head under my hand for a scratch behind the ears in that specific way he always had. It would let out a soft, contented groan as I rubbed his belly, a sound I knew as well as my own heartbeat. But these moments were always slightly off-key. They felt like carefully deployed weapons designed to confuse me, to keep me off balance, to make me doubt my own sanity. It wasn't him remembering, it was it learning. It was perfecting its role, using my own reactions as a guide. The breaking point, the moment my desperate denial finally crumbled into dust, happened in the woods. I'd been hearing strange noises from the forest at night, a high-pitched, chittering sound, almost insect-like. One Saturday, driven by a morbid curiosity I couldn't explain, I went looking. I took Buster with me, or rather, he followed me, a silent golden shadow at my heels. I pushed deeper into the trees than I usually did, into the damp, primordial heart of the woods. And then I found it, a small clearing, hidden by a thicket of thorns. In the center was a shallow pit, and in the pit were bones, animal bones mostly. Deer, raccoon, a few smaller skeletons I recognized with a sickening lurch as cats, and half buried in the dirt, caked in mud but still glinting in the dappled sunlight, was a small metal object. It was Buster's old collar, the red leather one with the brass name tag, the one he had been wearing the day he disappeared. It was torn, as if it had been ripped off with incredible force. I stared at it, the world dissolving into a low, buzzing hum in my ears. The real Buster had never come home. The real Buster had died out here in this place. My best friend was gone. The creature standing silently behind me, the one wearing his face, his fur, his body, was his killer. It was a cuckoo in the nest, a monster that had murdered my family and then come home to live with me. I turned around slowly. The thing that looked like my dog was watching me, its head tilted. There was no pretense in its eyes now, no attempt at canine affection, just a cold, ancient, alien intelligence. It knew that I knew. The game was over. Its mouth opened, but not to pant, The jaw unhinged, stretching wider than any dog's jaw should, revealing rows of needle-sharp, almost shark-like teeth. And from deep within its throat came a sound, a wet, clicking, multi-toned sound that was a grotesque mimicry of my own voice. Alex, it rasped, the name broken and distorted. Good boy. I didn't scream. The sound was trapped behind a wall of pure, paralyzing terror. I just backed away, step by agonizing step, my eyes locked on the abomination in front of me. It took a step forward, and its form seemed to shift, to ripple. Its front legs elongated, the joints cracking and reforming, becoming more like arms. Its spine lengthened, and it began to rise unsteadily onto its hind legs. It was a thing of impossible angles and fluid, unnatural movement, a half-formed nightmare struggling out of a familiar, comforting disguise. That's when I ran. I turned and sprinted through the woods, branches whipping at my face, my lungs burning. I didn't look back, but I could hear it behind me. It wasn't the sound of a running dog. It was a heavier, faster, loping gait, accompanied by that horrible, chittering click. It was toying with me. It could have caught me at any second. I burst out of the woods and didn't stop. I ran into my house, slammed and bolted the door, my hands shaking so violently I could barely work the lock. I stood there panting, my back pressed against the wood, listening. Silence. Then a soft, familiar scratching sound at the door. A plaintive, heartbreaking whimper, a perfect imitation of Buster when he wanted to be let in. "Alex," the whimper seemed to say, "let me in. I'm your best friend." I fled. I grabbed my keys and my wallet and nothing else. I went out the front door, got in my car and drove. I drove for hours, not caring where I was. Going, just putting as much distance as possible between me and that house, between me and that thing. That was a year ago. I live in a city now, a high-rise apartment on the 32nd floor, surrounded by the comforting, anonymous noise of millions of people. I don't own any pets. I flinch when I see a golden retriever on the street. I have nightmares every night. I know what it is now, at least in the abstract. I've spent countless hours in the dark corners of the internet, reading hushed-up folklore and frantic, pseudo-scientific theories. It has many names: skinwalker, a doppelganger, an echo, a thing that watches, that learns, that imitates, a predator that doesn't just hunt for food, but for lives. It steals them, wears them like a coat, and it does it so perfectly that you almost don't notice until it's too late. I thought I had escaped, but a few weeks ago I was walking home from work and saw a poster taped to a lamppost. It was for a missing cat, a fluffy Persian named Snowball. I would have ignored it, but something made me stop. It was the photo, a cheap color copy of a cat looking at the camera. But its eyes, they were flat, black, and held a cold, calculating intelligence that had nothing to do with a cat. They held an unnerving familiarity. I tore the poster down, my hands shaking. I know it's out there. It's here, in this city. It's shed its old skin and is trying on a new one. And I know with a certainty that has become the new anchor in my life that it's hunting again. And maybe, just maybe, it remembers me.